An hour before the stranger stumbled into their ravine, they were sitting by the fire deciding whose son to sacrifice to the spirits. Hunger had been gnawing at the tribe for the third winter. Children were dying from dirty water, and this was considered as normal as rain or cold. And then a naked man with white palms pushed aside the burning logs with his bare hands and did what none of them knew how to do. The cold struck first. Not the city's winter cold. Wet. Animalistic. It gnaws at the bones from the inside. Tae Hong opens his eyes and sees a black sky studded with stars until it's white. Stars like that don't exist anywhere else. He lies naked in a pit on wet stones and doesn't remember how he got here. The last thing left in his memory. A crack. The interns scream. A blow to the chest below the collarbone. Darkness. He sits up and groans. His body feels as if it's been run through a concrete mixer. He looks at his palms and doesn't recognize them. Too white. As if the top layer of skin had been peeled off. He clenches his fist. Unclenches it. His fingers work. An engineer always checks his tools before work. His hands are fine. Next. A ravine. Steep clay walls. Something is burning up above. He sniffs the air and catches the scent. Not coal, not gas. A damp fire. Wet wood smolders because there's no draft. That's the first thing his brain latches onto. Not fear. Poor draft. Then he hears voices. Sharp. Guttural. The language barks out short words, not a single familiar sound. Faces emerge over the edge of the ravine. Tae-hoon freezes. Skins on their shoulders. Tangled hair. Stone knives in their hands. Real ones. Flint chipped on one edge and tied to the handle with sinew. His engineer's brain processes one detail after another. Chipping technique. No polishing. Late Paleolithic. It's impossible, but the cold is real, and the stones beneath his back are real, so it's not a dream. So think. The man at the top raises his spear and yells. The second man swings a stone, and then a woman steps between them, a head taller than the rest, a dark braid down to her waist. Her face is stern, like someone used to making decisions for others. She utters a single, short word. The stone drops. The spear retreats. She looks down, straight at him. Tae-hoon doesn't know her name or her language, but he understands one thing. Right now, she is the only thing standing between him and a spearhead in his throat. He slowly raises his empty palms. Open. White. This gesture needs no translation. I am unarmed. The woman stares at his hands for a long time. Then she shouts an order to the others. A rope made of twisted hides drops down from above. Tae-hoon grabs it and climbs up. His hands slip on the wet clay. He swings over the edge and sees the camp for the first time. A smoky fire in the center. Crooked huts made of poles and hides. 30 or 40 people are looking at him. There is no malice in their eyes. Fear. They are afraid of the naked man with white palms. And he is already thinking. Task number 1. Don't die in the next hour. Task number 2. Show that I'm useful. An old woman tosses a thick, damp log into the fire. The flames hiss. White smoke billows. The children start coughing. The fire is almost out, and inside Tae-hoon, a light bulb goes off. Damp wood. No airflow from below. The fire is consuming itself. Every night these people freeze because they don't know how to build a fire. That's where he'll start. He strides toward the fire. The tribe recoils. The woman with the braid hurls a sharp word. He doesn't listen. He crouches down. With his bare hands, he pushes the burning logs apart. He gets burned. He hisses in pain, but he doesn't pull back. He pulls a damp log out from the center. He finds 3 dry branches. He stacks them like a small hut over the embers. He leaves gaps. The flame licks the dry wood and rises in an even column. The smoke drifts upward. It grows warmer. The child stops crying. The old woman freezes with her mouth open. Tae-hoon straightens up and catches the gaze of the woman with the braid. She isn't smiling, but a wall cracks in her eyes, and light breaks through the crack. He does not yet know that her name is Nam Yu, that she is the chieftain's widow and has been carrying the tribe on her own for the 3rd winter. That an hour ago, by this fire, They were choosing whose son to feed to the spirits to save themselves from starvation. He knows something else. These people are freezing. Their fire smokes. Their children are coughing. And in his head, he has 500 ways to fix this. They toss him a tattered hide reeking of sour fat. He wraps himself in it and sits down. A boy of about 7 with sunken eyes settles down beside him. He holds out a piece of half-raw meat. Tae-hoon chews for a long time, swallows, nods at him. The boy nods back. Their first conversation in this new world. The night drags on. The tribe falls asleep. Tae-hoon doesn't sleep. He counts. 36 people. 8 adult men for 36 mouths. Not enough. The huts are leaking. No food supplies, no storage pits or smokehouses. The outhouse is 10 steps from where the women fetch water. He closes his eyes and his mind races like a program. Clay, stone, wood, water. Everything is at his feet. He just needs to gather it right. Morning arrives, gray and damp. A woman's scream wakes him, heart-wrenching. By the far hut, a woman holds a dead girl in her arms. Gray lips, a swollen belly. Nearby, an old man in a necklace of fangs shivers, a shaman. Tae-hoon looks at the dead child, and a cold, clinical anger rises within him. Because he already knows what she died of. Yesterday, he saw women drawing water from a puddle where dogs urinate and where rain falls from the outhouse. Dirty water, diarrhea, dehydration. In his world, no one dies from this. It's treated with boiled water and a pinch of salt. The tribe wraps the girl in a hide and lowers her into a shallow pit. The shaman sings. The mother cries. The rest remain silent, as usual. They're used to burying children. It's as normal to them as rain or cold. No. Tae-hoon looks into the pit and repeats that word to himself. Not here. Not while I'm still standing. After the funeral, he walks along the stream. 2 men with spears follow close behind. They aren't guarding him. They're watching him. He looks. The stream flows down from the hill, clear at the top, murky at the bottom because people and animals defecate along the banks. Basic hydrology. He finds a spot further upstream, a sandy bank. He digs a hole with his palms, half a meter from the water. The men stare at him as if he were mad. Water seeps into the hole through the sand, through a natural filter, already odorless, without a film. He scoops it up with his palm, brings it to his mouth, drinks slowly, demonstratively, wipes his lips, doesn't fall, drinks some more. Then he pokes at the hole and slaps his stomach. Good. He points at the old puddle and crouches down. He falls. He closes his eyes. Bad. Death. The men exchange glances, but they look at the pit differently now. He returns and finds Nam Yu at her hut next to the shaman. He takes her by the hand. She tenses, but doesn't pull away. He leads her to the pit, silently. He scoops up water in his palm and holds it out. Nam Yu looks at the water, then at him. She leans down and drinks from his hands. He scoops up more. He brings the tribe's oldest woman. She drinks. By evening, the entire camp has gathered at the pit. Tae-hoon sits nearby and keeps watch. Every time someone heads toward the old puddle, he stands up and silently points at the pit. Time and again. By nightfall, they abandon the puddle. The next morning, no one runs into the bushes, clutching their supers. Not a single child is crying in pain. And the shaman Hwasan stands by his tent and watches the stranger across the camp. Yesterday, he sang over the dead girl and insisted that the spirits had taken her for the tribe's sins. Today, the stranger, without a single word in the language of the spirits, drove away the disease. Not with prayer, with a pit in the sand. Hwasan is a wise old man. He immediately understands what this means. If the stranger is right, then the spirits have nothing to do with it. If the spirits have nothing to do with it, then the shaman is unnecessary. If the shaman is unnecessary, then he is just an old man with bones around his neck. For 40 years he feared the forest in winter. Now, for the first time, he fears a human. 3 days pass. Tai-hoon teaches his first words: water, fire, stone. Good, bad. The name of the woman with the braid: Nam Yu. On the 4th day, he finds rich red clay on the shore. He kneads it in his hands. It'll do. It's too early for bricks. It's too rich. It'll crack when it dries. Perfect for plastering walls. He carries the clay to the fire and molds it. A rough, thick-walled bowl. No potter's wheel, no kiln. The children are the first to gather around. Then a young woman approaches, her hands speckled with green and her fingers long and nimble. In her eyes, there is no fear, only pure professional interest. She pokes at the clay. He hands her a piece. She sits down and kneads it faster and more evenly than he does. Here is my first worker, thinks Tai-hoon. Her name is Han Sol, a herbalist. On the 5th day, he builds a drying rack for firewood. 4 posts, crossbars, a rain cover. Dry wood goes into the fire. Wet wood goes under the shelter. In 2 days, they'll be dry. The fire stops smoking. The heat intensifies. The huts are woven. For the first time in 3 winters, the Grey Rock tribe isn't choking at night. On the 6th day, a girl with a scar across her eyebrow approaches him. Young, strong, she moves like a beast. She places a piece of meat in front of him. She looks him in the eyes. She utters a single word. Han Sol, standing nearby, laughs quietly and turns away. Later, he learns that when a woman of this tribe brings a man meat from her own share, it means more than words, much more. Her name is Chui Ran. Tai-hoon splits the meat in half and returns half to her. She sits down beside him and never leaves. On the 7th day, Hwasan comes to him in the night. Tai-hoon is awake. With a stick, he draws a plan on the ground for a real well with reinforced walls. The shaman stands over him and speaks at length. The words are indistinguishable, but the tone is clear. A threat. Not out of malice, out of fear. The old man fears that the world he knew is crumbling, that his gods are silent because the stranger speaks louder. Hwasan leans in, stares intently into his eyes, and disappears into the darkness. Tai-hoon remains over the drawing, the lines of the Jew, lines of walls, lines of a new world. 7 days ago, he was calculating the drainage for the 3rd building in Incheon. Now he sits in the Stone Age, in a stranger's skin, drawing a well with a stick in the mud. He laughs quietly. Then he falls silent. He looks at the sleepers. 36 people. They don't know about this yet. But they are his, and he will make sure that not a single one of them dies this winter. On the 8th day, Tai-hoon began digging the well. He chose a spot 30 paces from the camp on a small hill. The soil here was dense, clay with layers of sand. He pried up the top layer with a sharp stone and realized he couldn't manage it alone. An engineer's hands are good, but an engineer's hands weigh 70 kilograms and get tired after an hour. He needed help. Tai-hoon went to Nam Yu. She was sitting at the entrance to her hut, repairing the spearhead. He stood before her. He pointed to the spot where he had started digging. Then he pointed to the ground. Then he cupped his hands and pretended to drink. Water. There. Plenty. Nam Yu looked at him intently. She had already seen the hole by the stream. She had already drunk from it. She already knew that not a single child had fallen ill since the tribe began drawing water from there. She stood up. She called over 2 men. She said something briefly to them. They took sharpened sticks and went with Tai-hoon. They dug all day. The sticks broke. Clay stuck to them. The rocks wouldn't budge. By evening, the hole was knee-deep. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Tae-hoon stood at the edge and thought. In Seoul, he would have brought in an excavator, and in 2 hours the well would have been ready. Here he had 2 sticks and 2 men who looked at him as if he were crazy. But there was water down there. He could feel it in the way the soil changed. Dense, dry clay on top. Wet sand beneath it. The water table was close. Maybe 2 meters deep. Maybe 3. We had to keep digging. The next day he made his first real tool. He took a flat stone, found another heavier stone, sat down and began chipping away at the edge. Slowly, clumsily. His hands weren't used to this kind of work. In Seoul, he'd buy a shovel at a store, not make one out of a piece of flint. On the 3rd try, he managed to make something resembling a scraper. Wide, heavy, with a sharp edge. He tied it to a stick with a strip of rawhide. It turned into a hoe. A rough, ugly hoe. But it worked 3 times faster than a sharpened stick. One of the men watched as Tae-hoon dug with the new tool. Then he silently picked up a stone and began making one. By lunchtime, they had 3 hoes, and the hole was half a meter deeper. By evening, on the 3rd day of digging, the hole had reached a depth of a man's height. Tae-hoon stood at the bottom and felt the wet sand beneath his feet. He dug some more. Water emerged from beneath the sand. Murky, cold. He dug some more. The water flowed more strongly. Tae-hoon climbed out, covered in mud from head to toe. The whole tribe stood around the well. They watched as the water filled the pit, slowly, unstoppably. Pure underground water. Tae-hoon pointed it out to Nam-yu. Water. Good water. Always. Not a stream that dries up in the summer. Not a puddle by the camp. A well. Nam-yu stood and looked at the water in the pit. Then she looked at Tae-hoon, and for the first time in all these days, he saw something resembling a smile on her face. A small one, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Now they needed to reinforce the walls. Without reinforcement, the clay would wash away after the first rain, and the well would turn into a muddy puddle. Tae-hoon went into the grove behind the camp. He found young, straight trunks, thin, about as thick as an arm. It took half a day to chop them down with a stone axe. He stripped off the bark, sharpened the ends, brought them to the well, and began driving them vertically into the walls, one by one. He packed branches and clay between the trunks. The result was a rough but sturdy framework. The principle was the same as in formwork for concrete, only instead of plywood and rebar, it was wood and clay. Every time he did something new, people stood nearby and watched. He noticed this on the 3rd day of work. Not everyone, but a few people came every morning and just stood there, watching. One of them, a young hunter named Gu Ram, began helping without being asked. He simply walked over and started handing him stakes. Then Han Sol came. She didn't dig. She looked at the clay that Tae-hoon was mixing with water to make a plaster. She touched it with her fingers. She sniffed it. She said something. Tae-hoon didn't understand, but he sensed it from her tone. She was asking. He demonstrated. You take the clay, you knead it. You add water, you knead it again. Like this. Han Sol nodded and sat down next to him. By evening, she was kneading the clay better than he was. The well was ready in 12 days, a round shaft 2.5 times a person's height. The walls were reinforced with a wooden frame and plastered with clay. The water stood at knee level, clean, cold, odorless. Tae-hoon built a simple frame over the shaft and hung a rope with a clay. Lower it, scoop, lift, simple. The tribe drank from the well and didn't get sick. For the 2nd week in a row, not a single child died of a stomachache. It was a miracle. Not for Tae-hoon. For him, it was basic sanitation. But for these people, it was a miracle equal to the sun rising in the west. Hwasan was silent. For 2 weeks, he hadn't approached Tae-hoon. He didn't speak of him in public. But Tae-hoon saw. The old man was watching, every day, from the shadows of his hut, his face dark and unmoving. He waited. Tae-hoon knew people like that. On construction sites, there was always someone who waited silently for the new foreman to make a mistake, patiently, confidently, knowing that a mistake was inevitable. Hwasan was waiting for his mistake, and Tae-hoon had no doubt that a mistake would come. He was no god. He was an engineer in a foreign body, in a foreign world, with a foreign language. Mistakes were inevitable. The only question was whether he would manage to build enough before he made a mistake. Now for the bricks. The clay by the stream was too rich for bricks. He knew that. Rich clay cracks when it dries. He needed a lean additive. Sand, straw, something to reduce shrinkage. He found fine river sand. He mixed it with the clay in a ratio of about 1:3. He added dry grass for reinforcement. He needed it. He molded the first brick. He set it out to dry in the sun. 3 days later, he checked it. A crack, a long one, right through the brick. Taihun stood there looking at the crack, his first failure. Huasan was standing nearby. The old man looked at the cracked brick, then at Taihun, and walked away. He didn't say a word. There was no need to say anything. Taihun saw his face. The old man was pleased. All right. Taihun sat down and began to think. It had dried too quickly. The sun had dried out the top layer while there was still moisture inside. He needed to dry them more slowly, in the shade, under a canopy, and increase the proportion of sand. He made a new batch, 5 bricks, 1 part clay to 2 parts sand. More grass. He laid them out to dry under the firewood shed. He covered them with a hide to shield them from direct sunlight. He waited 5 days. He checked. 1 brick had cracked. 4 were intact. 4 out of 5. That was better. He picked up an intact brick. Heavy, dense, sturdy. He tapped it with a stone. The sound was dull and solid. It didn't crumble. It didn't break apart. Unfired brick. No firing. The simplest technology, 5,000 years old. No, 0 years old here, because no one before him had thought to mix clay with sand and dry it in a mold. He molded 20 more, then another 30. Han Sol and 2 other women helped. Tai Hong made a simple wooden mold, a rectangle of sticks tied together. You pack it with clay, you smooth it out, you take it out, you dry it. An assembly line, a primitive, dirty assembly line on the bare ground. But it worked. After 3 weeks, he had 200 bricks. After a month, 400. He began to build the first wall, not around the entire camp, a small wall around Nam Yu's hearth, a semicircle, as tall as a person, with an opening for the entrance. No mortar, just brick upon brick with a layer of clay between them. The wall went up in 2 days, crooked, uneven, ugly, but a wall. The wind stopped blowing into the hearth. The heat from the fire reflected off the bricks and stayed inside. Nam Yu entered the semicircle that evening. She stood inside. She touched the wall with her hand. The bricks were still warm from the day's sun. She turned to Taihun, and he saw in her eyes something he could not describe with any engineering term. She didn't say a word, but from that evening on, her belongings lay on the same side of the wall as his. A month had passed since his arrival. No one in the tribe had a stomachache anymore. The well provided clean water. Firewood was drying under the shelter. The fires burned steadily. The first walls provided protection from the wind. 200 new bricks were drying under the shelters. Taihun stood at the edge of the camp and looked at it all. And for the first time in a month, he allowed himself to think not about survival, but about the future. He needed a kiln. A real kiln for firing bricks. Unfired bricks are good, but brittle. They get soggy in the rain. They crumble over time. Fired bricks are a different story. Fired bricks last for centuries. The kiln requires a lot of firewood. He needs a pit. He needs draft. He needs a temperature of at least 600 degrees. 800 would be better. Is it possible to do this without a thermometer and without a gas burner? It is. People did it 6,000 years ago. He will do it now. But first, something else. In the evening, Cheiran came to him. She brought fish, 2 large fish. She placed them in front of him. She sat down next to him and said a long sentence from which he understood only one word. His own name. Taihun. She pronounced his name strangely, softer than it sounded,
with a breathy sound on the last syllable, as if his name were something warm that needed to be held carefully. He looked at her, a scar across her eyebrow.
Short, side-swept bangs, eyes direct and bright. She didn't look away. She wasn't shy. She stared right at him. Taehoon took one fish. He held the second one out to her. She shook her head. "Both are for you." He nodded in response. "One is for you." She smiled. She took the fish. They sat side by the fire and ate, in silence. And that silence spoke louder than any words. The kiln. Taehoon thought about it every day. He drew diagrams on the ground and erased them with his foot. He changed the design over and over. The problem wasn't a lack of knowledge. He knew how the simplest kiln worked. A hole in the ground, a grate made of stones, a loading chamber, a chimney for draft. The problem was the people. No one in the tribe understood why they should spend a week digging a hole in the ground when they could go hunting and bring back meat. Meat made sense. A hole in the ground didn't. Taehong went to Nam Yu. By this time, he already knew 30 words in the tribe's language. Not much, but enough to explain something simple. He took a mud brick and placed it in front of her. Then he splashed water on it. The brick began to soften. The clay started to dissolve. He pointed to the wall he had built around her hearth. Then he pointed to the sky. Rain, water, wall, bad. Nam Yu understood immediately. She had seen how spring rains erode the banks of a stream. She knew that water wears away stone. A wall of wet clay wouldn't survive the first downpour. Then Taehoon took another brick. He placed it in the fire. He held it there. He pulled it out with a stick. The brick darkened and became hot. He splashed water on it. Steam. Sizzling. But the brick didn't get soggy. It remained intact. Hard. Nam Yu touched it. She looked at Taehong. He said one word he had learned yesterday. Strong. Nam Yu nodded. The next day, 5 people dug a pit for the kiln. Taehong chose a spot on the hillside. This was important. The slope provided natural draft. Hot air rises. If the firebox is placed lower and the firing chamber higher, the air will flow through the kiln on its own. No bellows needed. No fan needed. Just the right angle. He marked out the pit with sticks. A long trench down the slope. The firebox at the bottom. The chamber at the top. A hot air channel between them. Cover everything with bricks on top and plaster it with clay. Leave an opening for the smoke. The simplest of designs. It's 5,000 years old in his world. Here, it's brand new. They dug for 4 days. Taehong worked alongside everyone else. His back ached. His palms were covered in calluses upon calluses. The stone hoe weighed 3 times as much as a steel shovel and worked 10 times worse. But he dug, silently, stubbornly. Guram was digging nearby. The young hunter asked no questions. He just worked. Taehoon valued that more than any words. When the trench was ready, he began building the walls, unfired bricks, the very same ones, then a layer of clay, thick, about 2 fingers thick, a grate made of flat stones laid with gaps between them, a loading hole on the side, a chimney made of a tube twisted from clay and dried in the sun. The pipe cracked. He made another one. It cracked again. The third one worked, crooked but intact. The oven was ready 8 days after they started digging. It looked terrifying, absurd, like the burrow of a giant mole. A clay mound on a hillside with 2 openings and a crooked pipe sticking out of it. Taehong stood in front of it, unable to believe that it would actually work. But his calculations said it should. There would be draft, the temperature would rise, the bricks would be fired. If the whole thing didn't fall apart the first time he fired it up. He loaded 20 unfired bricks into the chamber. He stacked them neatly, leaving gaps for the hot air to circulate. He sealed the loading hole with clay. He lit a fire in the firebox, slowly. First, kindling, then thicker twigs, then logs. Smoke rose up through the chimney. The draft was working. Taehoon sat down nearby and waited. He fed the fire every hour, log after log. The kiln heated up. The walls grew hot, then very hot. The clay plaster cracked in fine lines, but held. He stoked the fire all day, all night, and all the next day. Han Sol brought him food and water. She sat down beside him, silently. She didn't ask why he was sitting by this strange mound and feeding it fire. She just sat there. At dawn on the third day, Tai-Hoon stopped to add more wood. He let the kiln cool down. That took another day. He dismantled the seal around the loading opening. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from excitement. He peered inside. It was dark. He reached inside. He felt a brick. Hot, hard. He pulled it out. The brick had changed color. It had been grayish red. Now it was dark red. Tai-Hoon tapped it with a stone. The sound was different, ringing, clear, like pottery. He splashed water on it. The brick hissed. Steam. But no cracks, no crumbs. He placed the brick on a rock and struck it harder. The brick held. Tai-Hoon sat on the ground, holding in his hands the first fired brick in the history of this world. Of the 20, 14 survived. 6 had burst. The defect rate was high. But 14 bricks that would survive any rain, any frost, any winter. He laid them in a row on the ground and called for Nam Yu. She came. She looked. She picked one up. She tapped it as he had done. She heard the ringing sound. She looked at Tai-Hoon. And this time she smiled openly, broadly, for the first time in front of him. A week later, the kiln was running non-stop. Tai-Hoon organized the production. Han Sol and the 2 women mixed the clay. Guram and the boys shaped the bricks. Cho Ran hauled firewood. Tai-Hoon himself supervised the firing. An assembly line. A crude, primitive one, but an assembly line nonetheless. 20 new bricks every 3 days. The defect rate dropped to 2 out of 20 once he figured out the right firing settings. The bricks piled up. 50, 100, 200. He began to build. His first real house. Not a hut, not a semicircular windbreak. A house. 4 walls, a doorway, a roof of poles covered with animal hides and smeared with clay, a floor of packed clay. Small. 3 paces long, 2 wide, but a real house. He built it for Nam Yu, not for himself, not for the tribe, for her. Because she woke up every night from the cold in her ragged hut, because her feet ached from the damp ground, because a tribal chief deserves walls that keep the wind out. He built it for 10 days. Choi Ran helped. She turned the bricks with one hand and scolded him when Tai-Hoon tried to lift too many at once. She called him a word he didn't understand yet. Then Han Sol translated. Soft. She called him soft. It wasn't offensive. It was warm, like the name given to a child who hasn't yet learned to walk barefoot on stones. The house was ready. Nam Yu stood in front of it and didn't go inside. For a long time. Tai-Hoon waited. She walked around it. She touched the walls. She ran her hand over the bricks. Then she went inside. She stood in the middle. The ceiling was low. She could touch it with her hand. But there was no wind, no draft, no dampness. She stood there for a minute. Then she went out. She looked at Tai-Hoon and said 3 words. He understood only one. Good. But from her face, he understood all 3. That night, the whole tribe came to look at the house. They touched the walls. They knocked on them. They peered inside. Children ran in and out, squealing. An old man came in and sat down on the floor. He sat there for a long time. Then he went out and said something to the other elders. They nodded. Tai-Hoon didn't understand the words, but Han Sol stood nearby and quietly translated with a single gesture. The old man said it was as warm in there as inside a mammoth's belly. Tai-Hoon laughed. Han Sol laughed too. It was the first time they had laughed together. Hwasan didn't come to look at the house. He sat by his hearth and spoke with the 3 old men, quietly, for a long time. Tai-Hoon saw this. He knew that this conversation would bring nothing good. But right now, he didn't care. 14 bricks had survived the fire. The stove was working. The house stood, and Nam Yu, for the first time in 3 winters, would not sleep on the bare ground. He entered the house. He lay down on a bed of dry grass. Nam Yu lay beside him. not touching him, but close by. In the darkness, he could hear her breathing, steady, calm. She fell asleep quickly. For the first time in a long while, Tai-hoon lay there staring at the ceiling, the clay ceiling, his ceiling. And he thought about how tomorrow he would have to start building a second house, and a third, and a fourth, before winter came. Winter came early. The north wind brought the scent of snow 2 weeks before the first frost. Tai-hoon felt it in the morning when he stepped outside and the air hit his lungs like cold water. He looked at the settlement. One brick house stood, his, Nam Yu's. The rest were still huddled in their huts. 34 people in huts made of animal skins with holes through which the wind whistled. There were maybe 2 weeks left before the real cold set in. Maybe 3. He wouldn't make it in time. He wouldn't make it in time to build houses for everyone. There wouldn't be enough bricks. There wouldn't be enough time. There wouldn't be enough people. Tai-hoon stood there and counted. Just like on a construction site, when deadlines are looming and the client is threatening penalties. Count, think, find a solution. A brick house takes 10 days of work for 3 people. The whole tribe needs at least 7 houses. 70 days. He doesn't have 70 days. So no houses, no brick houses. He needs another solution. A quick one, a dirty one, a workable one. He thought about it all day. By evening, he found it. Not houses, walls. One long wall in a semicircle around the entire camp. Not from enemies, from the wind. A frame of poles, a coating of clay mixed with straw. Thick, a palm's width. Not brick, adobe. A mud brick wall. A technique used by farmers all over the world for thousands of years. Fast, cheap, warm. Not forever, but enough for the winter. He explained the idea to Nam Yu. By this time, he already knew 100 words, enough for simple sentences. A wall, a big one, all around, warm, no wind, all together, quickly. Nam Yu gathered the tribe. Tai-hoon stood before them and tried for the first time to explain something to a group of people. 30 pairs of eyes looked at him. He crouched down and began to draw on the ground. Here is the camp. Here is the wind. Here is the wall. Here is the warmth. He gestured with his hands. He drew with a stick. He spoke the words he knew. Nam Yu stood nearby and translated the rest. When he finished, silence hung in the air. Then Hwasan spoke. The old man's voice was calm, steady. He spoke for a long time, and everyone listened. Tai-hoon didn't understand everything, but he understood the main point. The shaman said that one must not hide behind a wall, that the wall would block their view, that enemies would approach unnoticed, that the Gray Father had given people skins and the wind so they could be strong, and whoever hides behind clay will become as soft as clay. It was a clever argument. Tai-hoon mentally gave the old man credit. Hwasan didn't say that a wall was a bad thing. He said that a wall is a weakness. For hunters, that's the difference. The tribe grew noisy. Opinions were divided. The young were for the wall. The elders were for the shaman. Nam Yu was silent. She waited. Tai-hoon realized this was his moment. Not an engineering one, a political one. If he started arguing with the shaman now, he would lose. The old man has known these people for 40 years. He has known them for a week. He would lose the argument. So, don't argue. Show them. Tai-hoon turned to Che-rang. He pointed to the spear in her hand. Then he pointed to the wall he had drawn on the ground. Then he pointed upward. Then he made a gesture with his hand. He threw an imaginary spear from top to bottom, from behind the wall. Che-rang understood instantly. Her eyes lit up. She turned to the hunters and spoke quickly and loudly. Tai-hung didn't understand a word, but he saw the men's expressions change. Che-rang was speaking their language, not the language of a builder, the language of a warrior. A wall isn't for hiding. A wall is for striking from above. The enemy is below. You're above. The enemy is exposed. You're protected. Who's stronger? The hunters exchanged glances. One nodded, then a second, then a third. Hwasan stood with a stony expression. He hadn't lost to Taihun. He'd lost to a girl with a scar who'd translated the thoughts of others into words that warriors understand. That was worse. Much worse. They began building the next morning. Taihun divided the men into 3 groups. The first dug holes for the post. The second hauled poles from the grove. The third mixed clay with straw. Each group did one task, just one, all day long. He explained to Nam Yu why this was so. If one person digs, then hauls, then mixes, they waste time with every transition. If everyone does one thing all day, everyone works faster. Nam Yu looked at him, then she nodded. Then she turned to the people and began giving orders. Taihung watched her and understood. She wasn't just a chieftain, she was a leader, a real one. One who doesn't just give orders, but organizes. One who sees who is tired and sends them to rest. One who knows who doesn't get along with whom and puts them in different groups. He was lucky she was on his side. The wall was growing, slowly but unstoppably. Taihun set posts every 2 steps. Between the posts, he wove a framework from flexible branches. Over the framework, he smeared a thick layer of clay mixed with straw. A handful at a time. He let it dry. Then he applied another layer. 2 layers. The wall turned out thick and heavy. Ugly, grayish-brown, but solid. The wind didn't blow through it. They worked from dawn until dark, 10 days in a row. Everyone's hands were covered in clay up to their elbows. Their backs ached, their legs throbbed, but the wall grew. On the 5th day, what Taihun had feared happened. A collapse. A 5-step-long section of the wall sagged and caved in. The clay hadn't dried. The framework couldn't support the weight. The posts had tilted. 3 days' work by one crew, down the drain. Taihun stood before the ruins and felt eyes on him. Everyone was watching. Hwasan stood at a distance with his arms crossed. He wasn't gloating, he was just standing there, and that was worse than schadenfreude. Taihun inhaled, exhaled. On a construction site in Dubai, the 6th-floor formwork had once collapsed on him. 12 cubic meters of concrete down the drain. The foreman was yelling. The client was yelling. The insurance company was yelling. Taihun wasn't yelling. He found the cause, a poorly secured support. He fixed it, poured it again. This time the foreman isn't yelling, because there is no foreman here, just 34 pairs of eyes. Taihun walked over to the collapse. He looked. The posts were too thin. The distance between them was too great, and he had rushed the 2nd layer of clay. He hadn't let the first one dry. His mistake, not the elements, not bad luck. His calculations were wrong. He turned to the crew. He pointed at the collapse. He pointed at himself. He said the word he knew. Bad. My bad. Then he crouched down. He sketched a new diagram on the ground. Thicker posts, closer together, cross beams between them. A triangular structure, sturdier, more reliable. Nam Yu looked at the drawing, then at the landslide, then at Taihun. She said one word. He recognized it. Next. They cleared the debris, dug in new posts, thicker, closer together, with cross beams. They started plastering again. First layer, waited a day. Second layer. The wall stood. Strong. On the 12th day of construction, the wall was closed. A semicircle from the edge of the ravine to the rocky outcrop, as tall as a man, a hand's width wide. On the inside, Taihun made steps out of stones and earth, a platform, so one could climb up and look over the wall, and throw a spear from above, just as Cho Ran had said. The first night behind the wall, the wind blew from the north, strong, vicious. The tents used to shake and groan in such a wind. Now it was quiet. The wall took the brunt of it. Inside it was quiet and warmer, noticeably warmer. The fire burned steadily and didn't flicker in the gusts. The smoke rose upward. The children fell asleep earlier than usual, not from exhaustion, from the warmth. Taihun sat by the fire and watched the sleeping tribe. Nam Yu sat down beside him, silently. She often did that. She would come and sit beside him. She wouldn't speak. She was just there. Sometimes that was more necessary than words. In the morning, it started snowing. The first snow of this winter, heavy, wet. It covered the entire camp within an hour. The wall stood. The wet clay had darkened but held. Tai-hoon went out and inspected every section. 2 spots were leaking. He patched them with fresh clay. An hour later, they stopped leaking. The snow fell for 3 days. When it stopped, the world around them was white and quiet. The stream was covered with a thin crust of ice. The trees stood bare and black. The temperature dropped. At night, it was so cold that a film formed on the water in the well. The people in the huts were freezing, even behind the wall. The skin huts didn't keep the heat in. Tai-hoon knew this. He knew that the wall was not the solution. The wall was time. Time to build houses, real houses, with stoves. He worked every day. The kiln produced 20 bricks in 3 days. He fired them non-stop. At the same time, he built a second house, a third, for the elderly, for families with small children. Small, cramped, but warm, with a hearth inside, with a chimney through the roof. Not a perfect chimney, a clay pipe that cracked from the heat and had to be replaced every 2 weeks. But it worked. The smoke went up, not into the lungs, up. By midwinter, the tribe had 4 brick houses, small, crooked, with ceilings that had to be propped up with sticks. But 4 houses. Old people and children slept in them. The young people were still in the huts. But the huts stood behind a wall and next to the brick houses, from which warmth radiated. There was a difference, a noticeable one. Khan Sol came to Tai-hoon on one of those freezing evenings when the air stings your nostrils and your fingers go numb in a minute. She brought a pot, a clay pot they had made together last week. There was water in the pot, hot water, with herbs. She'd brewed something. He didn't know the name, but the drink smelled of pine needles and something slightly bitter. He drank it. A pleasant warmth burned down his throat. His stomach warmed up. His hands stopped shaking. Han Sol sat next to him and looked at him. Then she quietly said something long. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. She was saying that her sister had died in the winter, a long time ago, when Han Sol was little, from the heat, from a fever that no one knew how to treat. Her sister's name was Dan Bi. Tai-hoon remembered that name. Han Sol spoke without crying. She just told him, the way people talk about the weather or what berries grow across the river. Evenly, quietly. Tai-hoon listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort her. He just listened. When she fell silent, he took her hand, held it, let go. Han Sol stood up and went back to her hut. The next day, she worked as usual, quiet, focused, her fingers green from crushed leaves. But something about her had changed. She felt lighter, as if she'd lifted a stone from her neck and set it down by the threshold. Winter dragged on. Tai-hoon counted the days, with notches on the wall of the house, a new notch every day. He counted 83 days from the first snow until the moment the stream was free of ice. 83 days. During that time, not a single child died, not one. 2 fell ill, coughing, fever. Han Sol gave them hot herbal tea and wrapped them in dry animal skins in the warm house. Tai-hoon heated stones in the stove and placed them under their bedding for warmth. The children recovered, both of them. When the second child was back on his feet, after a week of illness, his mother came to Tai-hoon. She stood before him. She looked at him in silence for a long time. Then she bowed, deeply, to the ground, and left. Tai-hoon stood there, not knowing what to say. He hadn't done anything special. A warm house, boiled water, a dry bedding, basic things. Things that in his world aren't even worth mentioning. Here, they were worth a child's life. Spring arrived wet and muddy. The snow was melting. The stream swelled. The wall was flooded on one side. Tai-hoon repaired it. He patched it up. He caulked it. The wall stood. The houses stood. The well worked. The stove was burning. And for the first time this winter, Tai-hoon allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. Spring brought 2 gifts and 1 misfortune. The first gift? The ground thawed. Tai-hoon had been waiting for this moment for 3 months. Frozen ground is stone. Thawed ground is material. Clay, sand, black soil. Everything he needed for the next step. He went out to the bank of the stream in the morning and knelt down. He plunged his hands into the wet earth. Black, rich. It smells of rotting leaves and life. Floodplain soil, fertile, rich. In his world, soil like this is traded. Here, it just lies there. No one knows what to do with it. Taihun knew. The second gift. Wild goats had come down from the hills. In winter, they stayed up high. Now, they had come down to the water. A herd of 20 grazed in the stream's floodplain a kilometer from the camp. Choi Ran had shown them to Taihun that morning. She said something about needing to gather hunters, to kill them, to bring back the meat, to stock up. Taihun shook his head. Not kill, catch. Choi Ran looked at him as if he'd said the moon was made of clay. Why catch them alive? A dead goat is meat and hide. A live goat is a problem. Taihun tried to explain. A live goat gives milk every day. A live goat gives birth to kids every year. One dead goat is food for a week. One live goat is food for 10 years. Choi Ran was silent. Then she said one word. By this time, Taihun knew it. How? Good question. Taihun thought for 2 days. Drive the herd into the gorge. Block the exit. Wait until the goats get used to it. Feed them. Tame them. Just in theory, incredibly difficult in practice. Goats are fast, smart, skittish, with horns. He told Nam Yu the plan. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked how many people were needed. Taihun answered, 10, for 3 days. Nam Yu looked at him. 10 hunters for 3 days meant 30 man-days without hunting, without fishing, without gathering. If the plan didn't work, the tribe would lose 3 days and get nothing. If it worked, she nodded. If it works, it changes everything. The next morning, Taihun stood on a hill with 10 men and explained the plan. Choi Ran commanded the herders. 5 men moved in a wide arc. 5 stood at the entrance to a narrow gorge behind the camp. That night, Taihun and Guram had set up a barrier of poles and ropes at the far end of the ravine. It was crude and rickety, but goats aren't horses. A 1.5-meter high barrier was enough to stop them. The herding began at dawn. Choi Ran led the herders. They moved quietly, forming a wide chain. The goats didn't notice them until it was too late. They darted to one side, then to the other. The herders didn't run. They walked, slowly closing in. The goats grew nervous. They circled around. Then they found a passage into the gorge. They ran. They burst inside. They crashed into the barrier. They turned around. People with spears were already standing at the entrance, shouting. The goats were running around inside. Taihong shouted, "Don't hit, don't stab, stand, shout, don't let them through." The hunters stood and shouted. The goats fought. They jumped. One leaped over the barrier and got away. A second one gored Guram in the thigh with its horns. He fell. He got up. He stood back up. An hour later, the goats were tired. They stopped fighting. They stood in the ravine, breathing heavily. 12 of them. 8 lost, but 12 remained. Taihun looked at them and felt a wave rise in his chest. Not joy, relief. It worked. The first step toward domestication. The first step from hunting to herding. The first step that, in his world, people had taken 10,000 years ago. Here, they had taken it today. The goats were wild. They wouldn't let anyone near them. They butted with their horns. One had to be tied up because she kicked out every time someone approached. Taihun ordered that they be brought grass and water, every day, morning and evening. Don't get too close, just leave the food and leave. After a week, the goats began to approach the food in the presence of people. After 2 weeks, one let him touch her, a small one, a young one, with a spot on her forehead. Ha-Nil, an orphaned teenager from the camp. Taihun had noticed her back in the winter. She used to hang around his workshop. She was picking up scraps of clay, modeling something, breaking it, modeling it again. Now she sat by the pen every evening and fed a goat from her hand, the little one with the spot. She named her with some word Tai-hoon didn't know. Then they translated it. Little Spot. The goat followed Han Yul like a dog. A month later, she began producing milk. Not much, but milk nonetheless. The first milk in the history of this tribe. Tai-hoon showed them how to handle the udder. He showed them how to strain it, how to boil it. When the first cup of hot milk ended up in Nam Yu's hands, her face took on an expression that Tai-hoon would remember forever. She drank slowly, her eyes closed. Then she opened them and looked at him as if he had just stopped the sun. And now there's trouble. She arrived in the third week of spring. The sentry on the wall shouted at dawn. Tai-hoon ran out of the house. He climbed the wall. He looked. People were walking across the floodplain from the south. 20, maybe 25. Men, with spears, with stone axes. Necklaces of black stones around their necks. Black flint. Tai-hoon had heard that name. Nam Yu had spoken it in the winter, with a heaviness in her voice. A neighboring tribe. One that had already come twice for women and salt. Chui Ran stood on the wall next to him. Her face was stony. Her hand gripped a spear. She said 2 words. Tai Gang, the chief of Black Flint. Tai Hong watched the approaching detachment and counted. 23 warriors. He had 8 men capable of wielding weapons. 3 to 1. No, worse. Those 23 were warriors. His 8 were hunters who knew how to kill beasts but had never stood in formation. Cho Ran alone was worth 3 of them. But even with her, the odds were bad. The detachment stopped 100 paces from the wall. A large man stood at the front, broad-shouldered, with a face covered in scars. Taegon. He looked at the wall, at the houses behind it, at the people on the wall, and Tai-hoon saw something in his eyes that he recognized immediately. Not anger, not greed, surprise, then interest, then calculation. Taegon shouted something. Nam Yu replied from the wall. Her voice was steady, firm, without fear. Tai-hoon didn't understand the words, but he understood the negotiations. He'd seen enough negotiations on construction sites. The tone, the pauses, the body language. Taegon demanded. Nam Yu refused. Taegon raised his voice. Nam Yu answered more quietly. That was strength. No shouting. Silence. The negotiations went on for a long time. Then Taegon fell silent. He looked at the wall once more. He turned away. His men left. Tai-hoon exhaled. Nearby, Chuidan loosened her grip on her spear. Nam Yu climbed down from the wall. She approached Tai-hoon. Her face was calm, but her hands were trembling. She hid them behind her back. She said that Taegon would come again, with a large number of men. He had seen the wall. He had seen the houses. He had seen that Grey Rock was no longer weak. And now he would want more than just women and salt. He would want everything. Tai-hoon nodded. He knew. He had known from the very beginning that this would happen. The wall protected them from the wind. The houses protected them from the cold. Now they needed protection from people. He looked at the wall. Wattle and daub, clay and straw. Good against the wind, bad against spears. They needed a palisade. A real one, made of logs, dug in deep, sharpened at the top, with a platform for archers, with pit traps in front of it. It would take time. A month, maybe 2. Would Taegon give him 2 months? Tai-hoon didn't know, but he knew something else. 34 people behind him. Not a single one had died this winter. They drank clean water from his well, slept in his houses, ate meat cooked over his fire, drank milk from the pen he had built. And now they were being threatened. His people. Tai-hoon stood on the wall and looked south, where the Black Flint squad had gone. His face was calm. Inside, calculations were at work. Cold, precise engineering calculations. The length of the perimeter, the diameter of the logs, the depth of the digging, the distance between the pits, the number of sharpened stakes driven into the bottom, the angle of the wall's slope to repel ladders, which the enemy most likely didn't have, but might. He didn't know how to kill, but he knew how to build. And a wall that cannot be breached kills just as well as a spear. Cho Ran stood beside him, silently. She looked in the same direction. Then she spoke a single sentence. By this point, Tai-hoon already understood enough. She said that if he built what was needed, she would kill anyone who approached the wall. Tai-hoon looked at her. She wasn't joking. She wasn't bragging. She spoke as if discussing the weather. It will rain tomorrow. If they come near, I will kill them. Just a fact. He nodded. They stood side by side on the wall, looking out at the empty floodplain. Two people who couldn't be more different. An engineer and a warrior. Gentle and sharp. The one who builds and the one who defends. And at that moment, on that crooked wall of clay and straw between them, something fell into place, like a keystone in an arch, quietly, precisely, forever. They began building the palisade the day after Black Flint left. Tae-hong hadn't slept all night. He sat by the fire and sketched on the ground, the perimeter, the line of defense. He decided not to encircle the entire camp. Too long, too many logs. Instead, he used the terrain. To the east, the camp was shielded by a ravine, deep, steep, impossible to jump over. To the north, a rocky outcrop. That left the west and the south, 2 directions, a total of 120 paces. That was doable. In the morning, he gathered everyone. Nam-yu stood nearby and translated. Tae-hoon spoke slowly. He chose his words from the 200 he already knew. The rest he drew on the ground. We need trees, thick ones, straight ones, as tall as 2 men, sharpened at the top, dug in to knee depth, tightly, shoulder to shoulder. Behind them, a platform of earth and stones so the defenders could stand higher and strike from above. In front of the palisade, a ditch, not deep, waist deep, but with stakes at the bottom. A running warrior won't see the ditch in the grass. He'll fall, he'll stumble, he's out. The hunters listened. Choi-ran listened. Gu-ram listened. Even Hwa-san stood at a distance and listened, though he pretended not to. Tae-hong finished explaining and looked at the people. Silence. Then Choi-ran struck the ground with the shaft of her spear, once, hard. She turned to the hunters and spoke a short phrase. The men stirred. They raised their axes. They headed toward the grove. Choi-ran looked at Tae-hong and nodded. He nodded back. They chopped down trees for 10 days. The stone axes dulled and broke. Tae-hoon made new ones. He taught Gu-ram to choose the right stones for the axe handles. Hard ones, with a fine grain. Not granite, flint, basalt. Gu-ram turned out to be a capable student. His hands were quick and precise. After 3 days, he was chipping away at the stone better than Tae-hoon, which wasn't hard. Tae-hong was mediocre at working with stone. He excelled at something else, looking at a mountain of work and seeing a sequence of steps in it. They dragged logs from the grove to the camp. Sleds made of 2 poles with a hide stretch between them, the simplest transport system. Tae-hong demonstrated. Don't carry them, drag them. A log on a sled weighs the same, but dragging it along the ground is 3 times easier than carrying it on your shoulders. At first, the hunters didn't believe him. Then they tried it. Then they stopped carrying anything on their shoulders at all. They dug the holes for the posts with hoes, the same ones used for the well, only longer. Tae-hong made a new batch, with handles tailored to each worker's height. For Gu-ram, a long one. For Han Sol, who also dug, one a handspan shorter. A small detail, but the right tool for the right person is the difference between by lunchtime and exhaustion by sunset. The logs were driven in vertically, tightly, with a finger's width of space. Wet wooden wedges were hammered between them. Wood dries and expands. The wedges hold the logs tightly together, a principle thousands of years old. They don't use it anymore on construction sites in Seoul. Here, it works perfectly. On the 15th day of construction, Hwa-san struck. Not with a spear, with a word. In the morning, Tae-hoon stepped out of the house and saw that no one was at the kiln. Usually, Han Sol and 2 women worked there from dawn. Empty. He went to the camp. People were sitting around the central fire, in silence. Their faces were somber. Nam-yu stood before them with her lips pressed together. Hwa-san stood beside her, with a shaman's staff, with a necklace of fangs, fully robed. He was speaking. Taehun approached and began to listen. He understood only a word here and there, but that was enough. Hwasan said that last night the Gray Father had appeared to him, the spirit of the forest. And the spirit said that a stranger was building walls from the bones of the earth, that the earth is alive and the stranger is cutting into its flesh, that if he is not stopped, the earth will stop providing. Grass will not grow, the beasts will leave, the fish will die, because you cannot cut into the mother and build with her body. Taehun stood and listened, and inside he grew cold, not from fear, from understanding. Hwasan had struck true, not at the wall, into the foundation. If people believe that clay is the flesh of the earth and that touching it means angering the spirits, all of Taehun's work will come to a halt. All the houses, all the walls, all the bricks, everything will turn into sacrilege. Clever. Very clever. Taehun looked at Namyu. She was looking at him, waiting. What will you do? He could have argued, could have said there are no spirits, that clay is just clay. But he wasn't in Seoul. Here, spirits are real. Here, people see the Gray Father in every tree. To say there are no spirits is to say that everything they believe in is a lie. They won't forgive. Never. So, don't deny it. Accept it, and turn it around. Taehun stepped forward. Everyone fell silent. He began to speak, slowly, with pauses, choosing each word carefully. He said he had heard the shaman, that the shaman was wise, that the Gray Father was great. Then he crouched down and took a handful of earth. He held it up. He showed it to everyone. Then he poured the earth back down. The earth returned. Then he pointed to the wall, to the bricks. He tapped them. Then he pointed to the ground, from it. Then he pointed to the house, to the hearth inside, to the warmth. To the sleeping child. Then back to the ground. Mother gives, we take. We make warmth for the children. Mother is glad. A long silence. Then Sun Mi spoke, Hwasan's daughter. Taehong had almost forgotten about her, a quiet girl with intelligent eyes who always stood in her father's shadow. She said that in the old songs, the great Mother River gives people fish, the Gray Father Forest gives people firewood, the earth gives too, gives. It is always given. Clay for pots, stones for knives, ochre for drawings. If the earth gives clay for pots, why can't it give clay for walls? Hwasan turned to his daughter. His face turned pale. She had struck him with his own weapon, his own songs, his own legends. Silence hung in the air, heavy, like a stone. Then one of the women stood up. She walked over to the hearth. She picked up a hoe. She began to knead the clay. A second followed her, a third. Work resumed. Hwasan stood by the fire and watched as the people dispersed. Sun Mi stood at a distance with her eyes downcast. She knew what she had done. She had defied her father in front of the whole tribe. In this world, a daughter does not argue with her father. Never. Taehong approached her that evening. She was sitting by the stream, washing her hands, red from the ochre. She was drawing something on the stones, signs, notches, marks. He sat down beside her, silently. Then he said one word, "Thank you." It was one of the first words he had learned in the tribe's language. Sun Mi looked at him, then she turned away. Then she said quietly that her father would not forgive her. Taehun nodded. He knew. Then he said she could come to his workshop whenever she wanted, that he would show her the signs, other signs, signs that count. Sun Mi looked at him. Something flashed in her eyes, a spark, small but bright. She nodded. 3 days later she came, with a flat stone and a piece of coal. She sat down next to Taehun and watched him draw. A line, 2 lines, 3, sticks, a count, 1 brick, 2 bricks, 10 bricks. Sun Mi picked it up faster than he expected. An hour later, she could count to 20. 2 days later, to 100. A week later, she was keeping track of the bricks on flat stones with little charcoal marks. The first accounting in the history of this world. The palisade was ready 25 days after construction began. 120 paces, logs twice a man's height, pointed, fitted tightly together. Behind them, an earthen embankment chest-high, a platform for the defenders. In front of the palisade, a moat 3 paces wide and waist-deep. At the bottom of the moat, pointed stakes driven in at an angle. The stakes are smeared with mud and covered with branches. You can't see them until you step on them. Tai-Hun stood on the platform behind the palisade and looked down. The moat, the stakes, the logs. Not a fortress, not a castle. A fence of sticks and a hole in the ground. In his world, this wouldn't even stop a drunken neighbor. Here, it was the most serious defensive structure for thousands of kilometers around. Chiran stood beside him. She ran her hand along a sharpened log. Then she looked at the moat. Then at Tai-Hun. And for the first time, he saw more than just interest in her eyes. Respect. Genuine. Deep. She said that with this wall, 5 men could hold off 20. Tai-Hun nodded. That was the point. Not numbers. Position. Fortification. Engineering. That evening, he sat by the fire, and Han Sol brought him some hot broth. They sat side by side in silence. Then she asked quietly, "Where are you from?" Tai-Hun was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Far away. Very far away." She nodded. She didn't ask any further. She simply moved closer and rested her head on his shoulder, gently, as if by accident. Tai-Hun sat motionless, feeling the warmth of her head through the fabric of his fur. And for the first time in all his time in this world, he didn't think about walls or bricks or moats. He thought about the fact that here, he had people he didn't want to lose. Tai-Hun found the copper by accident. He was walking along the stream upstream. He was looking for a new place to mine clay. They had worked the old one almost to the bottom. He was walking alone. Nam Yu had forbidden him from going alone, but he didn't listen. Sometimes he needed to be without people, without stares, without questions, just to walk and think. The stream meandered between the hills. The banks grew higher, the rocks larger. He rounded a rocky outcrop and saw an outcrop, a layer of rock eroded by water, gray, brown, and green spots in it, bright, unnaturally bright for a rock. Tai-Hun stopped, crouched down, touched it, scraped it with his fingernail. A green crust on the rock, malachite, copper oxide. Beneath the crust, the rock was different, heavier, denser. He broke off a piece, held it in his palm. Heavy, reddish-brown beneath the green patina. Native copper, not ore, pure metal. Weathered and oxidized on the outside, but soft and malleable inside. Tai-Hung's heart beat faster. Copper. In the Paleolithic era, finding copper is like discovering a titanium warehouse on a deserted island. Copper can be cold forged, no furnace, no smelting, just hammering it with a stone. It's soft, it bends, it takes shape. You can make a spearhead out of it, a knife, an awl, a needle, a fishing hook. Everything that turns out rough and brittle when made from stone turns out thin and strong when made from copper. And if he finds a way to smelt it, if he builds a hotter furnace, if he finds tin, then bronze. But that's later. Right now, copper. He gathered as many nuggets as he could carry, about 5 kilograms. He brought them back to the camp. He placed them by the fire. He picked up a flat stone. He placed a nugget on it. He picked up a hammerstone, and he struck. The copper flattened. It didn't split. It didn't crumble. It flattened. Tai-Hung struck again, and again. The copper flattened. It stretched. The edges cracked, but the center remained intact. He struck methodically, turned it, struck again. An hour later, he had a plate, thin, uneven, but a copper plate. People gathered around. They watched, silently. They had never seen metal. To them, everything was stone or wood or bone. Copper was something else. It shone, it bent and didn't break. It rang when tapped. Goram touched the plate. Then he tried to bend it. He bent it, straightened it, bent it again. His face changed. He understood. This material could be bent. Stone couldn't, wood couldn't, bone couldn't. But this could. Taehong worked with copper for 3 days. First, he made an awl, a thick copper needle. He sharpened one end on a stone. He gave it to Han Sol. She sewed leather with a bone needle that broke every week. A copper needle won't break. Han Sol took the awl. She tried it. The needle went through the leather like butter. She looked up at Taehun. Then she pressed the awl to her chest and said something quickly. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. Mine. I won't give it to anyone. Next, he made a knife. A small one, for Nam Yu. The blade was as long as his palm, rough, without a proper handle. He simply wrapped a strip of leather around the tang. But the blade was sharp, sharper than any stone knife, and it could be sharpened again and again. Stone gets dull and is thrown away. Copper gets dull and is sharpened, endlessly. Nam Yu took the knife. She looked at the blade. She ran her finger along the edge. She cut herself. A drop of blood on her fingertip. She looked at the blood, then at the knife, then at Taehun. And she smiled, broadly, dangerously, like a chieftain smiling after being given a new weapon. The third one he made was a spearhead for Che Ran. Not a whole spear, just the tip. He forged it for 2 days, hammered the copper on a stone, shaped it, leaf-shaped, wide, with a stiffening rib down the center. He didn't remember the exact shape of the spearheads from his textbooks, but he remembered the principle. A wide blade, a sturdy base, a groove for attaching it to the shaft. Che Ran brought him her best spear. He measured the shaft with his eyes. Thickness, length, weight. Then he adjusted the spearhead. He fitted it onto the shaft. He bound it with raw sinew. The sinew would dry and tighten securely. He poured melted resin into the joint. The spear was ready. Cho Ran took it. She weighed it in her hand. She gripped it. She lunged forward, then again. The bronze tip glinted in the light of the fire. She stopped. She looked at the spear. She looked at Taehun. Her lips trembled. She said in front of everyone that this spear was for her. Taehun said in front of everyone that it was for his woman because his woman was a warrior. Silence. Then Cho Ran turned away, quickly, abruptly, and walked away. But everyone saw. Everyone saw that the tribe's best spearwoman was crying, and everyone saw that she was hissing at everyone who was watching. Nam Yu stood at the entrance to the house and watched. Her face was calm, impenetrable. Then she went inside and lay down. Taehun came in later. He lay down beside her. In the darkness, Nam Yu said quietly, "She's a good woman." Taehun said nothing. Nam Yu spoke even more quietly. Han Sol, too. Taehun lay there staring at the ceiling. In this world, a leader could have several women. He knew that. He'd seen it. The old leader Nam Sok had 3 wives, and that was normal. But Taehun wasn't from here. In his mind was Seoul, with its rules. 1 wife, 1 love, 1 choice. That soul is dead. You're in a different world, with different rules. And the woman next to you just said she doesn't mind. He turned to Nam Yu. She wasn't asleep. She was looking at him in the dark. He reached out his hand. She took his hand, tightly. And so they fell asleep. In the morning, Taehun returned to the copper. He still had some nuggets left. He made fishing hooks, 6 of them, small, curved, with a barb so the fish wouldn't slip off. He gave them to the fishermen. That evening, they brought back twice as much fish as usual. The bone hooks would break and bend out of shape. The copper ones held up. He made 10 more hooks, then 10 needles, then 3 knives. The copper was running out fast. He needed more. He took Guram and went back to the outcrop. He pointed out the green spots. He explained, "This is copper. We need a lot. Dig. Take everything that's green and heavy." Guram dug, slowly, with difficulty. The nuggets were small, inclusions in the rock. He had to chip away at the stone and pick out the grains. They gathered 1 kilogram a day, maybe 1.5 kilos. Not much, but enough for now. Tehun knew that sooner or later he would have to smelt it. Cold forging was the limit. You couldn't make large items. You couldn't cast complex shapes. Smelting requires a temperature above 1,000 degrees. His kiln reached a maximum of 800. He needed bellows, forced air. He already knew how to make them. 2 leather bags with wooden nozzles. You pump them alternately. Air flows into the kiln. The temperature rises. But that's the next step. Right now, he had other things on his mind. Farmland. The floodplain of the stream awaited him. Black, rich soil. Wild grains grew along the banks. Barley, or something like barley. Spikes with small grains. Tehun plucked one, rubbed it between his fingers. A grain. Small, hard, but a grain. If gathered, if sown, if the land were plowed. If. He sat on the bank and looked at the floodplain. Green, wide, waiting. 10,000 years before the Neolithic Revolution. Or one engineer who knows that the earth can feed us if asked the right way. The plow turned out ugly. A crooked stick with a copper plowshare tied on with sinew. The plowshare was small, triangular, barely wider than a palm. Tehong himself understood that by the standards of his world, this was not a plow, but a mockery. But for land that had never been plowed, it would suffice. The floodplain soil was soft, loose. The grass roots didn't run deep. It didn't need a steel plowshare. It just needed some kind of furrow. He went out to the floodplain early in the morning, alone, with the plow on his shoulder. He thrust the plowshare into the ground. He pressed down. He pulled. The earth parted. A dark, damp furrow stretched out behind him. Tehum pulled the plow and thought about how the first farmers in human history had done the same thing. A stick in the ground, hands on the handle, back bent, feet planted firmly, and a strip of turned earth behind you. After 20 steps, he stopped. His back ached. His hands burned. He had walked 20 steps and could barely stand. A workday on a construction site in Dubai now seemed like a vacation to him. He needed draft power. A bull, a horse, anything. He had seen horses. Wild herds grazed on the steppe beyond the hills. But taming a wild Paleolithic horse is not the same as saddling a gelding at a riding club. It takes months of work. And a deadly risk. A horse weighing half a ton can kill with a single kick. No horse for now, just hands. He called some men, 5 of them. He showed them what to do. 2 pull the plow by ropes tied to the handle. 1 steers. 2 follow behind and break up clods with sticks. A conveyor belt, slow, heavy, but it works. In a day, they plowed a plot half the size of the camp. Not much by any standard, but for the first time in the history of this world, it's more than enough. Tehong gathered the wild barley grains himself. He walked along the bank of the stream and cut the ears with a stone sickle. He threshed the grains against a stone. He gathered a handful, then another handful. In 3 days, he had gathered enough to sow the plowed plot. He sowed by hand. He scattered the grains along the furrow. Then he walked over them and covered them with soil. Primitive, but the grain was in the ground. Now to wait. Sun, rain, time. A week later, sprouts emerged from the ground. Thin, pale green. Tehong stood at the edge of the field and looked at them, and smiled. Like a fool. Sprouts. Just sprouts. Grass from the earth. But in 2 months, this grass would become grain, and from that grain, one could bake bread, or cook porridge, or sow a field 10 times larger. Namyu stood nearby and didn't understand why he was smiling at the grass. He couldn't explain it. There weren't enough words. There wasn't enough context. How do you explain to a person from the Paleolithic era that a green blade of grass in a furrow is the beginning of civilization? That in 10,000 years, the descendants of that blade of grass will feed billions, that it all starts with a single grain in a single furrow? He simply said, "Food, plenty, later." Nam Yu looked at the sprouts, looked at him, nodded. She trusted him. After the well, after the wall, after the houses, she trusted him enough not to ask why. She just nodded and walked beside him. While the field grew, Tai Hong set to work on the mill. No, not the mill. The mill was still a long way off. A grain grinder. 2 stones, the bottom one flat with a hollow, the top one round. You put the grain in the hollow. You grind it with the top stone. The grain turns into flour, coarse, with stone dust, but flour. He found suitable stones by the stream, granite, rough, with a coarse grain, the perfect surface for grinding. He chipped away at the bottom stone, carved out a hollow, shaped the top one to fit. He showed Han Sol. She tried it. After a minute, she got the hang of it. An hour later, a handful of coarse flour made from wild grains lay on the lower stone. Han Sol touched the flour. She sniffed it. She licked it. Then she looked at Tai Hun, and he saw in her eyes the same thing he had seen in his own field: understanding. Not complete, but a start. She realized that this gray dust on the stone was something new, something that hadn't been there before, and that this something would change everything. Tai Hun showed her what to do next. Put the flour in a bowl, add water, mix, shape into a flatbread. Place it on the hot stone by the fire. Wait. The flatbread baked slowly. It smelled strange, burnt, yet at the same time warm and slightly sweet. Tai Hun took it off the stone. Flat, hard, gray. He took a bite. Tough. It crunched between her teeth from the stone crumbs. The taste was coarse and earthy, but it was bread, the first bread in this world. He broke the flatbread in half and gave one half to Nam Yu. She took a bite, chewed for a long time, swallowed. She took another bite. She didn't know it was bread. She didn't know the word. She didn't know the concept. To her, it was just a new way to make food out of grass. But she ate, and something in her face changed with every bite. It softened, as if this rough, gray flatbread were the most delicate thing she had ever tasted in her life. Tai Hun let the others try it. The reactions varied. The children spat it out. Too tough. The elders chewed cautiously. Cho Ran bit off a huge chunk and said that rocks tasted better. Then she took another bite. Hwasan didn't try it. He stood off to the side. He watched, silently. But Tai Hun noticed that the old man was watching every movement of his hands as he kneaded the dough, memorizing it. A smart old man. Even while resisting, he was learning. A week passed. The field was turning green. The goats were giving milk. Fish were being caught on copper hooks. The supply of smoked meat was growing. Tai Hun built a smokehouse, a simple one, a pit with a wicker grate and a shelter over it for the smoke. The meat was hung over smoldering coals and in 3 days turned into a dry, dense, cured sheet that could be stored for weeks. Before, the meat would spoil in 2 days. Now it kept for 20. The difference between hunger and satiety. Yuna appeared at precisely that moment. 3 hunters brought her in. They had gone scouting to the south and found her in a ravine. Beaten, half naked, with a rope around her neck. A runaway slave from Black Flint. Tai Hun stood and watched as they led her to the camp. She walked with her head down. She didn't raise her eyes. Her back was straight. Her chin was down. The posture of someone accustomed to blows. Nam Yu came out to meet her. She looked at the woman, at the rope around her neck, at the bruises. Then she turned to the hunters and said one word. They removed the rope. Yuna stood still. She couldn't believe it. Nam Yu led her to the fire, gave her food, gave her water, gave her a blanket. Yuna ate in silence, quickly, like an animal that doesn't know if there will be another meal. Tai Hun watched from a distance. He had seen people like this before. On construction sites in Dubai, there were workers from Bangladesh who ate the same way. Quickly, silently, with empty eyes. People who had been broken. In the evening, he approached her. She cringed, pulled away, eyes down, her hands pressed against her body, waiting for a blow. Tai-hoon sat down, not next to her, at arm's length, silently, for a long time. Then he said one word in the tribe's language, a name. She didn't understand. He pointed to himself, Tai-hoon. Then he pointed to her. Silence. Then she said quietly, almost a whisper, "Yuna." Tai-hoon nodded, repeated it. "Yuna." He stood up and left. He didn't touch her, didn't ask questions, didn't comfort her. He simply gave her a name and some space. That was all he could give on the first day. Yuna didn't leave the tent for 3 days. Han Sol brought her food and water. On the 4th day, she came out. She stood at the entrance and looked at the camp, at the wall, at the houses, at the people who were working and laughing and not hitting each other. Then she approached the women who were sewing hides. She sat down next to them. She took a needle and began to sew, silently, quickly, evenly. Her stitches were twice as neat as those of any woman in the tribe. Her hands knew the hide and thread better than Tai-hoon's hands knew clay. She was a master. A broken, battered master, but a master nonetheless. Black Flint's first raid happened at night. Tai-hoon woke to the watchman's cry, sharp, short, then a second cry, and the sound of a blow. The watchman fell silent. Tai-hoon jumped up. Nam Yu was already on her feet beside him. She moved silently and quickly, like someone accustomed to be roused by danger. They ran out of the house. Darkness, the moon behind the clouds. Almost nothing was visible, but Tai-hoon could hear. Shouts from the south side of the camp, the crackling of wood, the roar of men's voices. Black Flint had arrived. Che-ran was on the wall before anyone else. She had been waiting for this. Every night since Taigan first came, she had slept by the palisade in full gear. A spear with a copper tip, a stone spear at her belt. Her hair was pulled back with a leather strap so it wouldn't get in her eyes. Tai-hoon climbed up to the platform behind the palisade. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness. He saw them. Shadows stood beyond the moat. 10, 15, maybe 20. They had already found the moat. One of the attackers was lying at the bottom, screaming. A stake had pierced his leg. The rest stopped. They hadn't expected this. They had come to kill and take what they wanted. Instead, they encountered a pit of stakes and a wall of logs. One of them shouted the command. The group split up. Some went around the moat and moved along the palisade, looking for a way through. The other part stayed put and began throwing spears over the palisade. A spear struck a log next to Tai-hoon's head. He flinched. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He wasn't a warrior. He was an engineer. He didn't belong here. His place was in the rear. But there was no one in the rear. Only women and children in the houses, and him on the wall. Cho-ran didn't think. She acted. She saw a shadow behind the moat. She hurled a spear. A scream. The shadow fell. She was already holding a second spear, an ordinary one, with a stone tip. Gu Ram and 3 hunters stood beside her. They stood behind the palisade and hurled spears downward, from above. As Tai-hoon had explained, higher ground, the enemy below, an advantage. One of the attackers reached the palisade. He grabbed a log, tried to climb over. Cho-ran struck him in the shoulder with her spear. He fell backward into the moat, onto a stake. His scream cut off in a wheeze. Tai-hoon stood on the wall and did the only thing he knew how to do. He gave orders. He shouted, "Over there on the left, 2 on the right, hold the passage, stones, throw stones!" He had stockpiled stones on the platform in advance, cobblestones the size of a fist. The children had gathered them, 50 of them. Now the women were passing them to the defenders. Gu Ram threw with precision. A stone struck an attacker in the head. He slumped to the ground. The battle lasted until dawn. Not because the enemy was strong, it was because the darkness hit everyone. Spears flew in both directions, and no one could really see where they were striking. When the sky grew light, Tai-hoon saw that Black Flint was retreating. They were leaving quickly. They were carrying 2 men on their shoulders. 3 lay in the field, motionless. 1 at the bottom of the ditch, another by the palisade. Taihun climbed down from the wall. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat on the ground and breathed. His hands were shaking. He had never been in battle, not once in his life. The scariest thing that had ever happened to him before this world was a scaffolding collapse at a construction site. He had trembled then, too. But back then, it had been just a moment. Now, it had lasted for hours. Che Ran stood over him. She was covered in someone else's blood, on her hands, on her face, on the tip of her spear. She looked down at him from above. Then she crouched down. She placed her hand on his shoulder, heavy, strong, and she said one word. Standing. The wall stands. Taihun looked at her. He looked at the palisade. Not a single log was broken. Not a single post was knocked out. The moat had done its job. The stakes had done their job. The archer's platform had done its job. Everything had worked. Just as he had calculated. The wall holds. Casualties. The sentry is wounded. A blow to the head with a club. Alive. Han Sol is already over him. She's washing the wound with boiled water. She's applying a bandage made of clean strips of leather. Another hunter is wounded in the arm. The spear grazed him. It cut through the muscle, but the bone is intact. Han Sol washed this wound too. 2 wounds, not a single casualty. The enemy has 5 bodies. 5 men who came to kill and take, who met a wall and a moat and spears from above, and were left lying there. Taihun stood over the body of one of them, young, younger than Guram, with a necklace of black stones around his neck. His eyes were open. Taihun turned away. Then he forced himself to look again. He had to look. It was his wall, his moat, his stakes. This guy died because Taihun had calculated the depth of the pit and the angle of the sharpening correctly. He felt sick. He went behind the house and threw up. Choi Ran found him there. She stood by him while he came to. Then she said it was normal, that everyone throws up the first time, that what matters isn't that you threw up, but that you were standing on the wall when the spears were flying. Taihun straightened up, wiped his mouth, looked at her. She was calm. The blood on his hands had already dried. For her, it was work, just like mixing clay with sand was for him. Everyone does what they know how to do. He builds, she kills. Together, they held the wall. Nam Yu gathered the tribe around the central fire. She spoke at length. Taihun understood almost everything. His language had become fluent over these months. Not perfect, but fluent. Nam Yu said that for the first time in its history, Grey Rock had not fled. That before, every raid had ended the same way. A scream, a flight, the loss of men and supplies, then months of famine, then the next raid. Today they stood. Behind the wall built by the white-handed man, on the platform he had devised, with the weapons he had forged. And the enemy retreated, not them, the enemy, for the first time. Silence. Then Guram struck his spear against the ground, once, twice, 3 times, rhythmically. Choi Ran joined in. Then the rest of the hunters, the spears striking the ground, a rhythm. Not a victory cry, not a howl, a rhythm. Dull, heavy, like a heartbeat. Tae Hong stood among them and felt that rhythm in his feet, through the ground, through his bones, through his whole body. He wasn't striking with a spear. He didn't have a spear, but the rhythm was there, and he was part of it too. Hwasan stood by his tent. He watched. His face was unreadable. Then he turned. He went into the tent and took out a drum, an old one, made of stretched leather on a wooden hoop. He came out, sat down by the fire, and began to beat the drum, in time with the spear thrusts. Taihun watched the old man and didn't understand. Hwasan had resisted him for months, undermined him, intimidated him, waited for a mistake. And now he was beating the drum, in time with the tribe, in time with the wall. Later, Song Mi explained. The shaman hadn't given up. The shaman had adapted. If the wall stands, it means the spirits approve of the wall. If the spirits approve of the wall, it means the shaman approves of the wall. So the shaman had been right all along. Tai-hoon listened and shook his head. A politician. The old man was a politician, not a priest, a politician. And that made him more dangerous than before. A month of silence followed the raid. Tai-gan did not return. Tai-hoon knew the silence was temporary. Black Flint had lost 4 warriors. For a tribe of 50, that was a blow. Tai-gan needed time to recover, to recruit new fighters, or find allies. But he would return. Men like Tai-gan always return. Tai-hung used the silence, every day, from dawn until dark. First, the bags. He made them from 2 goatskins, sewed each into a bag, left an opening at the top, embedded a wooden tube into the opening, a long one. The tube led to the furnace. He attached a wooden frame with a handle to each bag. You press the frame down, the bag contracts. Air flows into the tube, into the furnace. You let go. The bag inflates. It fills with air. You press down again. The 2 bellows work alternately. One compresses, the other inflates. A continuous stream of air. The bellows were ready in 3 days. Crooked, leaky, air siphoned out of every hole. Tai-hoon sealed the seams with resin. It got better. Not perfect, but better. He placed the bellows by the kiln. Ha-Neil volunteered to pump. She was small and thin, but wiry and stubborn. She pumped the bellows non-stop for an hour. 2, 3. Tai-hoon watched the kiln. The temperature rose. The walls of the firebox glowed red, then yellow. He placed 5 copper nuggets into a thick-walled clay crucible. The crucible was placed in the hottest part of the furnace. Ha-Neil pumped. The furnace roared. The air hummed in the pipe. 2 hours later, Tai-hoon peered into the furnace through a crack. The copper in the crucible had lost its shape. The edges had melted. The surface glistened. It was... slowly, not completely, but it was melting. He waited another hour. Ha-Neil was exhausted. Gu-ram took her place. He stoked the fire rhythmically, steadily. The furnace hummed. Tai-hong pulled the crucible out with wooden tongs. Inside was a liquid, orange-red, heavy, scorching hot. Molten copper. He had prepared the mold in advance. He had carved a hollow in the shape of an axe into the stone. Roughly. He tilted the crucible. The copper flowed into the mold. Thick, bright. It filled the recess and solidified. An hour later, Tai-hoon broke the mold and removed the casting. A copper axe. The first cast tool in this world. Rough, with pits from air bubbles, with burrs, with a crooked edge that would require a long time to finish on a whetstone. But cast, not forged, cast. That meant he could make shapes of any complexity. Tips, knives, hooks, rings, anything that could be carved out of stone could be cast in copper. He held the axe in his hands and felt its weight. Heavier than stone. Denser, with a smooth surface that stone never has. Choi Ran stood nearby and looked at the axe. Then she reached out her hand. He handed it to her. She weighed it in her hand, gripped it firmly, struck the log. The copper sank 2 fingers deep into the wood. The stone axe sank 1 finger deep. Cho Ran pulled the axe out of the log. She looked at the blade. No cracks, no chips. She looked up at Tai-hoon, and he saw in her eyes what he had seen in Nam Yu's when he showed her the first fired brick. Understanding. This changes everything. Tai-hoon set up production. A grand word for what he had. 1 furnace, 1 set of bellows, 1 crucible, 2 casters, him and Gu-ram. But they cast, every day, axes, knives, arrowheads, dozens of copper needles, hundreds of fishing hooks. You distributed them. Every hunter received a copper knife, every woman a copper needle, every fisherman a copper hook. The tribe was changing, not all at once, gradually, like water wearing away stone. Hunting became easier. Copper arrowheads struck farther and deeper. Fishing became more productive. Copper hooks didn't bend. Sewing became finer. The copper needles didn't break. Every small tool improved one tiny part of life, and together they changed everything. Taehoon thought of the cave, that cave further up the river where the tribe went for ochre. He had heard about it from Song Mi. She had told him that there were old drawings on the walls of the cave, strange ones, not like the usual drawings of animals and hunts. Lines, symbols, something incomprehensible. He wanted to go take a look, but there was no time. There was always something more important: the wall, the furnace, the field, copper, war. There was no time. Until it appeared. At the end of the month of silence, Taehoon took Song Mi and went to the cave. Choi Rang tagged along, with a spear. Without her, Nam Yu wouldn't let him go anywhere beyond the camp. The cave was a 2-hour walk upriver, a narrow entrance in the rock. Inside, it was cold and damp. The walls were wet with condensation. Taehoon lit a torch. The light danced across the rock. He saw the drawings immediately: ochre and charcoal, deer, mammoths, figures of people with spears, ordinary cave paintings, nothing unusual. He went deeper inside. Song Mi walked beside him, pointing things out. These are the old ones, these are the new ones, and no one understands these. Taehoon held the torch up to the wall and froze. An arrow, a smooth, straight arrow scratched into the stone, not drawn, scratched, with a sharp metal object. The lines were too smooth for a stone tool. Next to it was a number, 7, the Arabic numeral 7. Taehoon stood and stared. His heart stopped. Then it pounded, hard, loud. An Arabic 7 in a Paleolithic cave. It's impossible. It's just as impossible as him being in this world. So he isn't the first. He ran his fingers along the lines, deep, old, covered with a thin layer of mineral deposits. These marks aren't months old, not years, decades, maybe centuries. Someone had been here a long time ago, a very long time ago, and left marks that only a person from his world could read. He looked further. Below the arrow, more lines, curves. Part of it had crumbled away, but he could make them out. An arc, wedges at the bottom, an arched vault. A fragment of a drawing of an arched vault. Whoever it was, he was a builder, or an architect, or an engineer, like Taehoon. Sun Mi stood nearby and looked at his face. She didn't understand the symbols, but she saw his reaction, and she was smart. Smart enough to understand that the white-handed man had recognized these symbols. She asked quietly, "Do you know what this is?" Taehoon was silent, for a long time. Then he said, "Someone was here before me, like me, just the same." Song Mi was silent. Then she said, "The old madman of the mountains." Taehoon turned to her. "A legend, all the tribes know it. For a long time, a very long time. When the grandmothers of today's grandmothers were little. A strange man lived in the mountains. He spoke a language no one understood. He built strange things. Then he disappeared, or died, or left, no one knows. But they fear him. They fear his shadow, his name, his memory." Taehoon stood in the cave and looked at the arrowhead in the stone. Someone like him, in this world, long ago. He built, he drew, he calculated, and he vanished. What happened to him? Why couldn't he finish what he started? What went wrong? Taehoon suddenly felt a chill, not from the cave, from within. After all, he too could vanish. He too might not make it in time. He too could become a legend about a madman. Choi Ran stood at the cave entrance and waited. She didn't go inside. She didn't like the dark. When Taehoon came out, she looked at his face and frowned. She asked what had happened. He shook his head. Nothing. Then he said, "We need to go back." On the way home, Song Mi was silent. She was thinking. Taehoon knew that look. She was piecing together in her mind what she had seen and what she had heard. Signs, an arrow, a number, an arch, the old madman, the white-armed one. She was the first person in this world to start tying the threads together, and Taehoon knew that sooner or later she would tie them all together. The summer of the second year brought people. First, a small tribe, 23 people. They came from the east, over the hills, hungry, ragged, children with swollen bellies. The old people could barely drag their feet. Their chief had died that winter while hunting. The women led the rest. They had heard of Grey Rock, of walls that do not fall, of water that does not hurt, of a man with white palms. Nam Yu went out to meet them beyond the gate. She stood there for a long time. She watched. Then she turned to Tai Hoon. He was standing behind her. She asked with a single glance. He nodded. Nam Yu let them in. A week later, a second tribe arrived. 31 people. From the southwest. These were stronger. Hunters. Warriors. But they ran out of salt, and 3 children died of fever within a month. Their chief was still alive, an old sinewy man named Park So. He didn't come to beg, he came to trade. My spears for your walls. Tae Hong sat next to Nam Yu during the negotiations and listened. Park So spoke respectfully but with dignity. Not a slave, not a supplicant, an equal. Tae Hoon accepted him, but on his terms. Not a trade, an alliance. One tribe, one law, one language. Shared supplies, a shared wall, shared labor. Park So thought it over for 3 days. Then he agreed. His hunters joined Chui Ran's band. His women went to the workshops. His children sat beside the children of Grey Rock by the hearth and ate from a single pot. A third tribe arrived a month later, a small one, 15 people, from the north. Among them was Ha Nil. Tae Hoon didn't know this. He was told later. An orphaned girl, 17 years old. Her family had been killed in a raid 2 years ago. Since then, she had lived with a foreign tribe. She did as she was told. She ate what she was given. She kept quiet. When her tribe decided to go to Grey Rock, she went with them. Not because she wanted to, because there was nowhere else to go. Tae Hoon noticed her on the 3rd day. She was standing by the kiln, watching. Not the fire, the mechanism, the bellows. The way Guram pumped the handle and the air hummed through the tube. She watched the way Han Sol had watched the clay the first time, with hunger, with greed. Tae Hoon approached. He asked her name, Han Yul. He asked what she saw. She was silent. Then she said the bag was breathing. Tae Hoon looked at the bellows. The bag was breathing. An accurate description. She wasn't seeing a tool. She was seeing living movement. Inhale, exhale. She thought like an engineer, without even knowing the word yet. He told her to come back tomorrow. She arrived at dawn. He showed her the bellows, took them apart, put them back together. He pointed out every detail, the leather, the frame, the tube, the valve. She listened in silence. Then she put the bellows back together herself, faster than he had demonstrated. Her hands were dexterous, quick, dirty, bite-marked nails, scars on her fingers. The hands of someone who fixed everything that broke because there was no one else to do it. Tae Hoon looked at her and saw himself, 20 years ago, on the first construction site, when everything was new and incomprehensible and unbearably interesting. The camp was growing. 120 people, then 150. The huts no longer fit behind the old wall. Tae Hoon expanded the perimeter. A new palisade, a new moat, wider, deeper, with a double row of stakes. Now it wasn't a camp. It was a village, with a street. A single street from the gate to Nam Yu's house, trodden down, smooth. On either side, houses made of brick and adobe, small, cramped, but homes. Tae Hoon introduced a system. Every family received a house. Every house was built to the same plan. 4 walls, a hearth, a chimney, a door, a window covered with oiled leather. Standard. He hated that word on construction sites in Seoul. Here, it saved lives. A standard house was built in 7 days by a 4-person crew. Everyone knew their job: dig, lay, plaster, roof. An assembly line. 20 houses in 3 months. Yuna found her place. Tae Hoon saw how it happened, slowly, piece by piece. At first, she just sewed, mending old hides. Then she started cutting out new ones. Then she figured out how to sew hide and plant fiber fabric into a single garment. Warm on the outside, soft on the inside. Then she made her first jacket. A real jacket with sleeves and a fastening of bone buttons. Taihun saw this jacket and stopped. He just stood there and looked. It was clothing, not a hide thrown over the shoulders, clothing, tailored to the body, with seams, with a pocket. Yuna stood before him and waited. Her face was tense, her hands were clenched. She was still waiting for a blow, every time. Taihun said it was the best thing he'd ever seen in this world. Yuna blinked. Then she turned away. Then she turned back. Then she said she could make more, lots more, for everyone, if they gave her a place. Taihun gave her an entire house to use as a workshop, a separate one, with a long table made of flat stones, with shelves for hides and thread, with a window for light. Yuna entered that house. She stood in the middle. She touched the walls. Then she sat down on the floor and sat there silently for a long time. Han Sol stopped by in the evening. Yuna was sitting on the floor, sewing. Her eyes were red, but her hands were steady. The stitches were perfect. She had found her place, for the first time in her life. A week later, 4 women were working for her. A month later, 8. Yuna gave orders quietly. Without shouting, without commands, she showed them, corrected them, showed them again, patiently, endlessly patiently, like a person who knows that patience is the only thing no one can take away from her. Autumn brought the harvest. The field yielded grain, a little. 4 sacks of wild barley. By the standards of any farmer from his world, it was laughable. By the standards of this world, it was a miracle. Grain from the earth, not found, not gathered from wild fields, grown, planted by human hands and grown by human will. Taihun stood at the edge of the field and looked at the cut ears of grain. Nam Yu stood nearby. Han Sol stood nearby. Chu Ran stood nearby. Song Mi stood nearby with a clipboard on which she was recording the number of sacks. Yu Na stood nearby in a jacket she had sewn herself. Ha Nil stood nearby with her hands smeared with coal and clay. 6 women. Each had found her place. Each was doing something no one else in this world had done before her. Taihun looked at them and thought, this is it. This is the beginning. Not walls, not copper, not bricks. People. People who know how and who want to. People who were given a place and a tool and told to get to work. This is what cities are built from. Tai Gan arrived in the fall with an army. Tai Hong stood on the wall and counted. 40 warriors, maybe 50. 3 times as many as last time. Black Flint had brought allies. 2 foreign tribes marched alongside his men. Different necklaces, different face paint, but identical spears pointed at Grey Rock. Tai Gan stood at the front, large, broad, with a new scar across his cheek that he'd gotten in the last raid. He looked at the walls, at the palisade, at the houses behind it, at the smoke rising from dozens of hearths. And Taihun saw no anger in his eyes. Hunger. Tai Gan didn't want to destroy. He wanted to take. Nam Yu stood on the wall next to Taihun. Her face was stony. Her hands were steady. She had seen this before, many times. Only before, she hadn't been standing on the wall, but in the field, and running. Now she stood. Tai Gan shouted, "Hand over the white-handed one. We won't touch the rest." Nam Yu replied, "No." Tai Gan shouted again, "Then we'll take everything." Nam Yu didn't answer. She simply turned to Cui Rang and nodded. Cui Rang raised her spear. 22 defenders on the wall raised their spears in unison. Silence. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and smoke. Tai Gan waved his hand. The attack began. They advanced quickly, not in formation, in a mob, shouting, as they were accustomed to. A raid, to overwhelm, crush, kill, take. The first 10 reached the moat, and the moat swallowed them. 2 fell onto the stakes. A third sank waist deep and got stuck. The rest slowed down, They panicked. The wounded screamed in the darkness of the moat. Spears flew from the platform behind the palisade. Stones. Chui Ran aimed with precision. Every throw hit its mark. Standing beside her were Pak So's hunters. The old chieftain had brought his best men to the wall. He fought in silence, without a shout. He hurled spears as rhythmically and steadily as he breathed. Tai Hong stood behind the second line and gave orders. Left flank, the stones are running out. Bring more from the river. Right flank, 2 have made their way along the ravine. Go, Ram, head there. Hold the center. Conserve spears. Throw only when you're sure. He wasn't fighting. He was directing. Like on a construction site when 3 sections are being poured at once, and you have to keep all 3 in mind. Only here, they weren't pouring concrete. Here they were pouring blood into the moat in front of the wall. Tegan realized that a head-on attack wasn't working. His men were dying in the moat and at the foot of the wall. He pulled his warriors back. He regrouped. He divided them into 3 units. He sent 2 to the flanks. He left 1 in the center. Clever. Stretch out the defenses. Find a weak spot. Tai Hong saw it. The left flank. There, the wall abuts a rocky outcrop. Between the wall and the rock is a crevice. Narrow, just wide enough for 1 person. He had blocked it with stones and logs, but hadn't fortified it properly. There wasn't enough time. He knew that this was a weak spot. Tegan found out too. One of his scouts spotted the gap. A squad of 10 men moved toward the rock. Tai Hong shouted to Che Rang. She had already seen it. She jumped off the wall. She ran toward the gap. 4 men with her. They made it in time. The enemy reached the gap and began clearing the debris. Che Rang struck the first one with her spear through the gap. Gu Ram met the second with a stone axe. The third broke through inside. Cho Rang spun around. The copper tip flashed. The warrior fell. The fight at the gap lasted several minutes. Long, bloody minutes in the cramped space between rock and tree. Cho Ran fought like a beast, quickly, silently. Only the rasp of her breath and the clang of bronze against bone. Then it fell silent. The gap was blocked with bodies and stones. No more came from the flank. In the center, Tai Gang made a final attempt. His men brought logs. They threw them over the moat. They ran across them toward the palisade. Tai Hong had been waiting for this. He had prepared hot water, 3 large pots on fires behind the wall. Boiling water. When the first warriors began climbing the palisade, Tai Hong gave the order. Pour. Boiling water poured down on the heads of those climbing. Screams, shouts. People fell back into the moat, scorched, blinded. It was terrifying. Tai Hong stood and listened to those screams, and inside him everything tightened. He had done this. He had thought of this. He had poured the boiling water into the pots and set them on the fire. He knew what would happen, and he did it anyway. Because behind the wall were 150 people. Children, old people, women. His people. Tegan retreated, for good. He led his men away, slowly, with difficulty. Half his army lay in the field and in the moat. The rest were trudging away, beaten, broken. Tegan walked last. He turned around once. He looked at the wall, at Tai Hong, who was standing atop it. And there was no hatred in his eyes. There was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that he had not lost to a man. He had lost to the wall. Tae-hun climbed down from the wall. His legs buckled. He sat down. Che-ran approached. She was covered in blood. A lot of blood. Not all of it was someone else's. A wound on her shoulder, deep. The spear had grazed her, tearing away skin and muscle. She stood there without even flinching. She looked down at him and said, "It stands, just like then, after the first raid. The wall stands." Han Sol ran over with boiled water and bandages. She washed Che-ran's wound. Che-ran hissed and cursed, but sat still. Han Sol worked quickly and precisely. Clean hands, clean water, clean bandages. Basic field medicine that didn't exist in this world a month ago. In the evening, they counted the casualties. 2 killed. A hunter from the Pak So tribe, a spear through the chest, and a young man from the first tribe they'd accepted, a stone to the head. 2, against more than 20 of the enemy. Namyu stood over the bodies, silently, for a long time. Then she ordered a burial, a new burial, not in a pit behind the ravine, on a hill, with a stone over the head, with a name on the stone. Sun Mi carved the names, the first names carved in stone in this world. Tae Hong stood by the graves and thought of the wall, of pots of boiling water, about the screams of the burned people. He built a wall to protect his own. He killed strangers to protect his own. There is no difference between a copper spearhead and a pot of boiling water. Both are the work of his hands. Both kill. An engineer who builds weapons is still a weapon. He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the city, at the houses, at the walls, at the children playing by the well, at Han Nil hauling a bucket of water, at Yu Na sewing at the workshop entrance, at Han Sol bandaging the wounded, at Choi Ran standing on the wall with her shoulder bandaged, at Nam Yu walking between the houses with her back straight and a heavy look in her eyes. That's why. That's what it's all for. The pots of boiling water are for this. The wall is for this. Everything is for this. In the winter of the second year, Tae Gan died, not by the hand of Tae Hoon, not by the spear of Cho Rang. He was killed by one of his own, one of the warriors whose brother had been scalded with boiling water at the wall of Grey Rock. The warrior believed that Tae Gan had led them to their deaths for the sake of his own vanity, and he was right. That night, he entered the chieftain's tent and struck him with a stone axe. The news was brought by the fugitives. 5 men and 8 women from Black Flint arrived at the gates of Grey Rock 3 days after the murder, unarmed, with children, hungry. Among them was Tae Gan's eldest son, a 10-year-old boy, skinny, with his father's eyes. Cho Ran stood on the wall and looked at him, her hand on her spear. Tae Hoon stood beside her. He looked at the boy. He looked at Cho Ran. He spoke softly. A child. She pressed her lips together. She took her hand off the spear. Nam Yu let them in, like everyone else, under the same conditions. One law, one language, common work. Tae Gan's son looked at Tae Hong from under his brows, with hatred. Tae Hong saw it. He knew. He understood. This child would hate him for years, perhaps for his whole life. He sent the boy to school. Yes, to school. It appeared in the fall. A small house next to Sun Mi's workshop, 3 walls and a roof. Inside, clay benches and a slab of flat stone on which Sun Mi wrote with charcoal. She taught the children to count, to read their first characters, to write. 20 symbols, each represented a sound, not a word, a sound. Tae Hong explained the principle of the alphabet to her. Not like hieroglyphs, where each character is a whole word. Letters. Each character is a single sound. 20 characters are enough for the entire language. Sun Mi grasped it instantly. In a month, she created an alphabet. 22 symbols. Angular, simple, easy to scratch into clay, easy to remember. The first writing in this world. The first tablets. Grain accounting, a census of people, a list of tools, records of births and deaths. Bureaucracy. Boring, mundane bureaucracy. The foundation of any civilization. Wasan watched the school from afar, every day. He stood and watched as the children drew symbols on the tablets. Then one evening he came to Sun Mi. Tae Hoon didn't hear the conversation, but he saw the result. The next day, Wasan sat in the school. He told the children legends, old songs, stories about the Grey Rock and the Great Mother River and the Grey Father Forest. And Sun Mi wrote them down. For the first time in the history of this world, the oral tradition was being recorded on clay. Wasan watched as his words turned into symbols, and something in his face was changing, slowly, like dawn. He understood. His songs would die with him. His memory would die with him. But the symbols on the tablets would remain, forever. He was no longer afraid of Tae Hoon. He was afraid of being forgotten. And Tae Hoon had given him immortality. Clumsy, clay-bound immortality on the tablets of a 20-year-old girl. But immortality nonetheless. The winter of the second year was milder than the first, or so it seemed, because the houses were warmer, the stoves were better, the food was more plentiful. Grain reserves, smoked meat, dried fish, goat's milk, the first real cheese. Tae-hoon showed Han-sol how to curdle the milk. Heat it, add sour juice, wait, squeeze it. Add salt, press it down with a stone, wait. The result was nothing like the cheese from the supermarket. White, soft, lumpy, slightly sour. But it was cheese. Protein that keeps for weeks. Energy in a small piece. Han-sol tasted it first. Her face. Tae-hoon would have liked to draw her face at that moment, but he couldn't draw. She chewed slowly. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them and said one word. More. In the spring of the third year, Tae-hoon began building in earnest. Not a house, a city. He scribbled a plan on a large clay slab. The central square, 4 streets radiating from it. Residential quarters, workshops, warehouses, a school. Son-mi's House of Signs, Yuna-'s workshop, a blacksmith shop, a pottery workshop, a communal kitchen, a bathhouse. Yes, a bathhouse. A room with hot water. A stone furnace heated the stones. The stones heated the water in a clay basin. The first bathhouse in history. When Chae-ran first stepped into the hot water up to her waist, she stood motionless for a minute. Then she slowly sank down to her shoulders. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them and looked at Tae-hoon, who was standing at the entrance, waiting for her verdict. She said he was either a god or a madman. Then she said she didn't care. Then she closed her eyes again and didn't come out of the water until evening. The city grew. 200 people, 300. By the spring of the third year, 500. People came, from all directions. Small tribes, fragments of larger ones. Lonesomes, fugitives, craftsmen who'd heard that in the city of the white-armed, skilled hands were valued. Hunters who'd heard that in the city no one went hungry. Women who'd heard that in the city no one was beaten. Nam-yu was in charge. Quietly, precisely, without shouting. She knew everyone by name, knew who got along with whom, who could do what, who lied, who kept quiet. She was the brain of the city where Tae-hoon was the hands. Tae-hoon understood this. Without her, the city would have fallen apart in a month. Not because of the walls stood. Because of the people. People can't be stacked like bricks. People quarrel, they get jealous, they steal, they fight. Nam-yu kept them together. Not by force, by rules, the first laws. Don't steal. Don't hit without a reason. Don't take another man's woman. Work, eat, share. Simple rules. Carved by Son-mi on a stone slab at the entrance to the square. Everyone who entered the city saw them first. Those who couldn't read had them read aloud. Every morning, every evening, until they memorized them. Tae-hoon stood on the roof of the first 2-story house. His house. He had been building it for a month. A stone foundation, brick walls, wooden floors, a clay roof with tiles made of fired clay. 2 stories, the first for living, the second for work. Blueprints, plans, schematics, his study, the first study in this world. He stood on the roof and looked down. Lights, dozens of lights, from every house, from every workshop. Smoke rose in even columns into the dark sky. His furnaces, his chimneys, his city. Son-mi came to him at night, not with a confession, with a tablet. She had been working on the cave symbols for 3 months. Every evening after school, she would sit in her house of symbols and draw, compare, count, erase, start over. Tae-hoon had copied all the cave symbols onto a separate tile for her. An arrow, a 7, a fragment of an arched vault, and a few more lines that he had only noticed on his second visit. Dots, dashed lines, groups of 3 and 5. Son-mi laid out the tiles in front of him. She pointed to the dots. This isn't a drawing, it's a count. Tae-hoon looked. 3 dots, pause. 5 dots, pause. 7 dots, 3, 5, 7. Odd numbers, a sequence. He frowned. Sunmi pointed further. Underneath the dots were lines, vertical, grouped. She counted them for a week, recounted them, again and again. 12 groups. Each group had a different number of lines. 12 groups, 12 months. Taehoon felt a chill. A calendar. Someone had left a calendar in the cave. And if 12 groups meant 12 moons, then the lines in the groups were days. Sunmi counted the total. 354. A lunar year. Taehoon sat staring at the tablet and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The old madman knew astronomy. He knew that a lunar year has 354 days. He knew odd numbers. He knew about the arch of the sky. This was no ordinary man. He was an educated man from a developed world, just like himself. But Sunmi had found something else. The most important thing. She pointed to the edge of the tile, where Taehoon hadn't noticed while copying. Another group of dots, separate from the rest. 3 dots, horizontal, then an arrow pointing down, then a number. Taehoon squinted. 12 short lines and 1 long one. 13, Sunmi said quietly. The 13th moon, the 3rd day. An arrow pointing down. Here, come here. Taehoon looked up. The 13th moon. In the lunar calendar, a 13th month is added once every 2 or 3 years to align with the solar cycle. An embolismic month, a leap correction. Whoever left these marks knew about the leap lunar month, and he set a date. The 3rd day of the 13th moon. The place, the cave. But when? Every year. Every time the 13th moon comes, come to the cave on the 3rd day. Taehoon was thinking. The 13th moon this year comes in the spring, in 2 months. Sunmi looked at him. You'll go? He nodded. She nodded. Then she said she would go with him. He wanted to refuse. He couldn't. Her eyes left no room for refusal. 2 months until the 13th moon. Taehoon worked. The city was being built. A stone gate. The first real stone gate with an arch. Taehoon remembered the fragment of the blueprint in the cave. An arched vault. The madman knew how to build arches. And he left that knowledge in stone. Now Taehoon was building the arch himself. Wedge-shaped stones, each one carved by hand, with copper chisels that broke every day and that Gu-Ram reforged every evening. A semicircular wooden formwork. The stones are laid along the formwork. The last stone, the keystone, it fits perfectly. It wedges the arch. The formwork is removed. The arch stands. A principle that is 3,000 years old in his world. Here, 0. The formwork was removed in the morning. Taehoon stood and watched. The arch stood. Stone held stone without mortar, without glue, only geometry. Only right angles, just physics. Ha-Nil stood nearby, mouth open, eyes wide. She was looking at the arch, and Taehoon could see she was calculating, in her head, without a formula sheet, calculating angles and pressures and loads. She didn't know those words yet, but she saw the essence. The stones press against each other, and that's what holds them together. The harder they press, the stronger they are. She turned to him. She said, if the stones are longer, the arch is wider. Taehoon nodded. That's right. She said, if there are 2 arches side by side, you can place flat stones on top, and it will be a bridge. Taehoon looked at her. She was 17. She had never seen a bridge. She'd never heard the word bridge. And she'd just invented a bridge, from scratch, from a single arch. He said, that's right. She smiled, widely, from ear to ear, with dirty cheeks and broken nails and coal dust in her hair. At that moment, Taehoon realized what he hadn't been able to put into words before. He didn't need to build everything himself. He needed to build the first one, and then they would take it from there. Ha-Nil, Sunmi, Gu-Ram.
They would carry on. They were already carrying on. The pottery districts operated without him. Yuna ran the workshop without his guidance. Han Sol healed without his advice. Che-Ran trained the militia according to her own rules, which worked better than his theories. The city lived its own life, not his. Theirs. The last few weeks before the 13th moon, Tae-hoon spent time with Nam-yu. Quiet evenings in their home. She sat beside him and mended clothes.
He sketched. They hardly spoke. There was no need. 2 years together. Words had become superfluous. One evening, she put down her sewing and said she was afraid. Tae-hoon set down his charcoal. He looked at her. Nam-yu wasn't afraid of anything. Not raids, not winter, not hunger, not death. She was afraid he would leave, that he would go into the cave and never return, that whoever had brought him here would take him back. Tae-hoon was silent, because he'd been thinking about that himself, every night. What if the cave was a door? What if it were possible to go back, to Seoul, to his own world, to a hot shower and coffee from a vending machine and a phone screen? He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at Nam-yu, at the woman who had carried an entire tribe on her shoulders for 3 winters, who had taken in a naked stranger with white palms and refused to let him be killed, who had stood beside him before the whole tribe when no one else believed in him yet, who fell asleep beside him every night and was the first person he saw every morning. He took her hand. He said one word, "I'll stay." Nam-yu squeezed his hand, tightly, until it hurt, and he felt her hand stop trembling. On the morning of the 3rd day of the 13th moon, Tae-hong walked out of the city gates. Song-mi and Che-Reng walked with him. Nam-yu stood at the gates. She watched. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just stood there and watched until he disappeared around the bend in the path. The cave was empty. Tae-hoon stood inside, looking at the markings on the wall. The torch crackled in Song-mi's hand. Che-Reng stood at the entrance, looking out. It was quiet. Only water dripped from the ceiling. Tae-hoon ran his fingers over the arrow, over the 7, over the fragment of the arch. Cold stone, old lines, nothing else, no one. He didn't know what he was expecting. A portal, a voice, another person, anything. Nothing. He sat down on a rock. Song-mi sat down next to him, silently, waiting. Tae-hoon looked at the wall and thought, maybe the date is wrong. Maybe the year is wrong. Maybe the madman has been dead for a long time, and these marks mean nothing except that someone once scribbled on the wall out of longing for a home that no longer existed. They sat in the cave until evening. No one came. Nothing happened. Tae-hoon stood up. He brushed the dirt off his knees. He looked at Sun-mi. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the wall, at the farthest edge, where the torchlight barely reached. She raised the torch higher. She stepped closer and froze. Tae-hoon approached. He saw it. New markings, fresh, not covered in mineral deposits, scratched in recently, maybe a month ago, maybe a week. An arrow, pointing north, and beneath it, 3 words, in Korean, Hangul. Tae-hoon read them, and his hands trembled. I'm coming to you. Someone had been here, recently, someone who writes in Korean, someone who knows that Tae-hoon will read these words, someone who is coming, to him. They returned to the city in silence. Tae-hoon walked and thought. Che-Ran walked beside him and asked no questions. She saw his face and knew that now was not the time. Song-mi walked and said nothing. But Tae-hoon knew that the same mechanism was at work in her mind that was at work when she deciphered the calendar. She was piecing things together, connecting the dots, calculating. Sooner or later, she would ask, and he didn't know what he would say. How do you explain to a person from the Paleolithic era that you're from the future? That your world consists of billions of people and machines made of iron and houses reaching up to the clouds? How do you explain it without destroying everything he's built here? Because if they find out he's a visitor from the world of the gods, then everything he's done will become not craftsmanship, but a miracle. Not work, but magic. and they'll stop following his lead. They'll stop learning. They'll wait for a miracle. But miracles don't happen. There are bricks and wells and hose. There is work. The spring of the third year was the warmest since Taehong had arrived in this world. The snow melted early. The streams swelled. The floodplain was flooded, and when the water receded, the soil remained rich and black, perfect for sowing. Taehong sowed 3 fields, 10 times more than last year. 100 people worked the fields. Pairs of men took turns pulling the plows. The copper plowshares cut through the earth evenly and deeply. The grain fell into the furrows. Children ran behind and trampled it down. A system, rough and primitive, but a system. The city was alive. 5,000 people by the end of spring. A stone gate with an arch. Pottery quarters. A copper smithy. The first written tablets recording grain. A school where 40 children learned to count and read. Yu Na's workshop, where 20 women sewed real clothes. Han Sol's herb house, where they treated patients with boiled water, clean bandages, and decoctions that worked not because people believed in them, but because they contained the necessary substances. Che Ran's retinue, 50 warriors, trained, armed with copper, in leather armor from Yu Na's workshop, with spears and knives from the Gurama, standing on the wall built by Taehong. Envoys arrived, from afar, with tribute, furs, salt, slaves. Taehong freed the slaves, every single one, without exception. He removed the rope from their necks. He gave them food. He gave them shelter. He gave them work. He sent them to school. The first envoys watched this with bewilderment, then with suspicion, then with something akin to horror. They didn't understand. A slave is a thing, a valuable asset, a gift. And this pale-handed man takes a gift and turns it back into a human being. Why? Taehong didn't explain. Nam Yu explained for him, gently, diplomatically, in a language the ambassadors understood. A free man works better than a slave. A free man builds better than a slave. A free man defends the city better than a slave, because he has something to lose. The ambassadors nodded. Not all of them believed it, but they all left with a thought they hadn't had before, that a person can be more useful than a thing. That was the beginning. Small, imperceptible, but a beginning. A wedding. Nam Yu proposed it herself, quietly, in the evening, at their home. She said the city must see that a leader and a builder are one and the same, that their union is the foundation, like stones in an arch. Taehun looked at her. She was talking about politics, about a symbol, about consolidating power. But her hands were trembling, and her voice was quieter than usual. She was talking about politics, but she meant something else. He said yes. She exhaled, long and deep, like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time. They devised the ritual together. No sacrifice, no blood, no shamanic dances. Hwasan was against it. Then he was for it. Then against it again. Then he waved his hand and said he'd do as he was told. He was tired of resisting. Not because he'd lost, because he'd seen. He'd seen the city. He'd seen the school. He'd seen children who don't die in winter. He saw the wall that holds everything together. He saw the plaques where his songs live. And he understood that this was the will of the spirits. Not his old spirits, new ones. Spirits of fire and clay and copper and knowledge. The ritual was simple. Taehun and Nam Yu stepped out onto the square. Before them was a hole in the ground. In the hole was a sapling, a young oak. Taehun knelt down. Nam Yu knelt down beside him. Together they covered the roots with soil. Together they watered it. Together they stood up. The tree stood between them, small, slender, alive. In 50 years, it would be taller than any house in the city. In 100 years, their great-grandchildren would sit beneath it. If they had great-grandchildren. Nam Yu couldn't have children. Taehun knew this. She knew that he knew. And neither of them cared. The city was their child. The 5,000 people were their child. the school, workshops, walls, wells, all of it was theirs, together. Huasan blessed them at the stone arch. The old man stood in new robes, not a hide with fangs, pure fabric from Yuna's workshop. Around his neck, not bones, but a copper emblem shaped like a hammer, a symbol of creation. A new cult. A cult in which the god is not the spirit of the forest, but the very act of building. Taihun saw this and felt uneasy. He didn't want to be a god, didn't want to be a symbol, wanted to be an engineer. But the city decided otherwise. Everyone stood nearby, Han Sol with a baby in her arms, not his own, rescued. The boy was born a month ago. The birth was difficult, blood, screams, just like back then, that first winter. Taihun stood nearby again and spoke a single word: breathe. Han Sol gave birth. The boy cried out. The mother survived. Now Han Sol carried him as her own. The mother had no objection. In this world, that meant honor, not loss. Cho Ran stood in full battle armor, tanned leather, copper plates on her shoulders and chest, her hair tied in a knot, a spear with a copper tip in her hand, that very one, the first, the one he had forged for her. She wasn't crying. She stood as if stone, but her lips were pressed so tightly together they had turned white. Sun Mi stood with a tablet in her hands. A word was carved on the tablet, the first word she had devised for the new language. City. Not a settlement, not a camp. City. A place where people live together of their own free will. Yuna stood in a dress, her own dress, one she had cut out and sewn herself. From fabric she had woven herself. White, simple, beautiful. The first dress in this world sewn not from animal hide, but from thread. She stood upright, her chin raised, her back straight. No one would have recognized in her the woman who had arrived 2 years ago with a rope around her neck, unable to lift her eyes. Hanil was the last to arrive, in a soiled apron, her hands covered in soot, her cheeks smeared with clay. She had come running from the mill. Yes, the mill. A hand mill. A stone millstone on a wooden frame. Hanil had built it herself, based on Taihun's blueprint, but she built it herself, with her own hands. And the millstone turned, and the flour poured out, and the bread was baked. Every day, for 5,000 people. Taihun stood in the square next to Nam Yu, next to a tree, next to everyone. Smoke from hundreds of hearths rose into the sky, steady, clean. His ovens were burning fuel properly. The smell of bread hung over the city. Real bread, made from grain that grew in the field he had plowed, from flour ground by the mill his apprentice had built, from dough kneaded in the bakery his mason had built. A chain, a long one, from a single grain in a single furrow to 1,000 loaves on 1,000 tables. And at that moment, a sentry shouted from the northern wall. Taihun looked up. Everyone looked up. On the road, on that very road that Taihun had ordered to be built 6 months ago, paved with stone, smooth, straight. A man was walking slowly toward the city along this road, alone, an old man, gray-haired, thin, hunchbacked, with a wooden staff. He walked slowly, step by step, like a man who had been walking for a very long time and was very tired, but would not stop until he reached his destination. Taihun watched. Nam Yu stood frozen beside him. Che-ran stood frozen beside him, her hand on her spear. Song Mi stood frozen beside him, the tablet pressed to her chest. The old man reached the gate, the stone gate with an arch that Taihun had built based on the blueprint from the cave. The old man stopped. He raised his head, and Taihun saw his staff, wooden, darkened by time. And at the top of the staff, a smooth arrowhead was carved, just like the one in the cave, just like the one on the stone beneath the foundation in Incheon. The old man looked at the arch, at the walls, at the houses, at the smoke, at the people, at Taihun standing in the square with a young tree behind him and a woman by his side. The old man smiled. The wrinkles on his face formed a pattern that spoke of decades. Alone in this world, without a city, without walls, without people who listen. Alone. He opened his mouth and spoke in pure Korean, without an accent, clearly, wearily. "It's been a long time, young man. I was already thinking no one would come." Tae-hoon stood and looked at the old man. 3 years. For 3 years he had thought he was alone here, that he was the only person from his world in this endless, wild emptiness. For 3 years he had been building walls, houses, a city, people, alone, with a head full of blueprints and hands full of calluses, alone. And now, standing before him, was a man who knew what Hangul was, who knew what an arched vault was, who had carved a 7 and an arrow into the cave and waited, for years, for decades, his entire life in this world, waited for the one who would come next. Tae-hoon stepped forward. Nam-yu stepped with him. He reached the gate. He stood before the old man. They looked at each other. 2 engineers, 2 builders, 2 people who had been cast into a world where their knowledge was worth more than gold, which had not yet been invented. The old man looked at the city behind Tae-hoon, at the stone arch, at the straight streets, at the smoke from the ovens, at the children running along the cobblestone road, at the woman in a white dress by the workshop, at the warrior with a bronze spear on the wall, at the girl in a stained apron by the mill. The old man looked at all of this, and tears streamed down his face. Because he had tried to do the same thing, long ago, alone, without a city, without Nam-yu, without Che-ran, without Han Sol, without Son-mi, without Yu-na, without Ha-nil, alone. And he couldn't. Tai-hung held out his hand. The old man looked at his palm, white, calloused, covered in clay and soot and copper, the hand of a builder. The old man took it, firmly. Tai-hung said, "Come in. You're home." The old man stepped over the threshold of the stone gate. He entered the city, the first city in this world, a city built by the hands of a man who knew 500 ways to make the world a better place, and found 500 people willing to believe him. The gates closed behind the old man. Smooth, clean smoke rose above the city from hundreds of hearths. In the square stood a young tree planted by a husband and wife. In the school, a plaque hung on the wall with 22 letters of the new alphabet. A copper hammer was cooling in the smithy. Fabric lay in the workshop. The smell of bread filled the bakery. Medicinal leaves were drying in the herb house. A sentry stood on the wall, gazing into the distance. Tai-hoon stood in the midst of it all. The old man was nearby. Nam-yu was nearby. Everyone was nearby. And for the first time in 3 years, Tai-hoon's face was that of a man who knew he was not alone, that he had never been alone, that someone had been waiting for him for 10,000 years, and that now they could finally build together.